away because so much debris was falling down. Now we're getting very close to the point of the explosion. Again, obviously, it was a fuel explosion. How it happened, nobody knows. And then there is that painful mention made by Dan Molina from one of the experts who helped design the shuttle that we may never know what happened. That, of course, would be very bad indeed as we go forward, and if we go forward in the space shuttle program as we are doing now. Now, the close-up on your left, there is the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger this morning, about 11:39 Eastern Time, and those two prongs moving out. One of them we can certainly identify as one of the solid rocket boosters, perhaps the other is, and then you see all types of debris raining down, and what, Tom, you described a little earlier as kind of a strange beauty there, a blue sky. The launch took off this morning. The weather was very clear, a delay for just a couple of hours there because of the weather conditions. To recap, it's been mentioned that the President has delayed or canceled his State of the Union address for tonight. He's moved it for 1 week. The House will meet in session, and they will, of course, pay tribute to the astronauts. Vice President Bush is now heading down toward the Cape. He is going with the acting administrator, Donald Graham. And also we expect to find a little bit more about, hopefully a lot more about what happened coming up in a little less than an hour now at 3:30 Eastern Time when NASA holds a news conference at the Kennedy Space Center at the Cape. Now back to Washington and Tom.
Thanks, John Palmer. We've just been handed a press release by something called Corroon and Black in Space, Inc. That's a leading United States and international satellite and space insurance brokerage firm. It announced today, earlier, that it had donated a personal accident insurance policy to Sharon Krista McAuliffe, the high school teacher who will be the first private citizen to fly aboard the shuttle. The policy provides $1 million of coverage and includes all of McAuliffe's activities while she is riding as a passenger aboard the Orbiter Challenger on this mission. That was donated before the launch of today's flight, the launch that was tragically witnessed by Krista McAuliffe's husband, her 2 children, and her parents. Steve Delaney is at the Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral, Florida, where George Bush and the acting administrator of NASA will be headed under President Reagan's directions. Steve? Apparently we're having some audio difficulties, of course, with Steve Delaney, who's at the Cape. We want to just bring you up to date on what is likely to happen. We're going to have continuing coverage here on NBC News until this story is resolved in one form or another, and then we'll continue our coverage even after that. President Reagan has scheduled a special address to the nation tonight from the Oval Office directly. There has been a postponement of the State of the Union speech, which was scheduled before a joint session of Congress at 9 o'clock tonight, now postponed for 1 full week as the enormity of this tragedy begins to unfold, really, for all of us, individually and collectively. The tragedy begins to really deepen and to have the effect that any kind of tragedy of this sort has on all of us, because we are bound together in so many ways by the space program, and in a way, I suppose, that all of us were riding with Krista McAuliffe today. And now let's go back to the Kennedy Space Center and Steve Delaney. Steve?
Yes, Tom. When Vice President Bush was first elected, was first in office early in 1981, I came down here with him to watch him go through a guided tour of the Columbia Space Shuttle, which was the first one to fly, had not yet flown. And he was met by astronauts Young and Crippen, who were the first crew, and they took him all over the thing. They walked him up the ramps, and they took him inside the control compartments, and they showed him the surfaces and explained to him what they were going to do. He's been closely associated with the space program ever since then, and was the one government official not too many months ago who was presiding over the ceremony in which Krista McAuliffe was selected as the first teacher to go into space, the first civilian, really, to go into space. Mr. Bush will be coming down here with a heavy burden. He will be the one who will try to convey the nation's condolences, the nation's sympathies on the loss of the crew, not only to the McAuliffe family, but to the families of the other astronauts who were here. Several of them were staying around town, and they together, because the crew composed seven different people, were quite a sizable contingent of family, well-wishers, close relatives, not so close relatives in some cases. Some of the flyers on this group had extensive families, and a lot of them were here. But the Vice President will come down. He will be one of those who will try in an official way to express his sympathy, the President's, the kinds of feelings that have caused the delay in the State of the Union message, which was scheduled for tonight. Officially, the United States government is putting aside its business in a way, so that through the offices of the Vice President and his associates who will be coming with him, they can try to ease the burdens and ease the pains of those who have felt this loss. It is not one of the brighter facets of the job of being Vice President, but it's that sort of duty that falls on one from time to time. So he'll be here later, and I'm sure that he'll be closeted in private with the survivors, the families of today's crew. Tom?
Very much. Steve Delaney at the Kennedy Space Center will ask you to stand by there, of course, until we get any kind of an official word. And we do expect in about 45 minutes from now that NASA will have a press briefing at the Cape Canaveral at the Kennedy Space Center there. With me now is Norman Baker. He's the editor of Defense Daily here in Washington, which is a publication of Space Publications Incorporated. This is obviously a great tragedy for the families of the astronauts that are involved and for the space program as well. Wouldn't you think that we'll have serious, enormous delays that we can't even foresee at this time in the space program, both politically and technologically and financially?
Well, yes, Tom, it's really hard to imagine what effect it's going to have on it because, first off, this is the first major setback, truly major setback that the space program has had since its inception. We did have that Apollo 1 fire in which 3 astronauts were killed while they were testing the spacecraft on the ground. But all along, we have felt that this shuttle was designed with a reliability factor that we could actually set it up almost as an airliner. This is why we had all the civilians going aboard. And I think it has really set in a state of shock for the space program to realize that we had forgotten, really, how dangerous the program really could be.
Do you think that it was a mistake for NASA to have put civilians on board as early as they have?
No, I really don't think so, although one failure out of 25 launches is not a very good reliability. There's something drastically wrong here, and it's going to take some time, I'm afraid, to find out what went wrong.
And it was just 2 launches ago that we had some other indications of trouble with the main engine. Remember when
Exactly.
when it shut down automatically and they thought that they may have to make a quick return?
Well, yes, and you know, there's so many factors here, so many parts that can go wrong. And I'm afraid it's not going to be one of those flights where we find out what went wrong with this one and we go on with the next one. I think there's going to be a lot of questions raised politically by the Congress of the United States and by the American people. Is this thing really a reliable system? Or do we want to go on with this until we can find maybe a better system?
Mr. Baker, that spacecraft cost $1.2 billion to build. It probably will cost, given the way things go here, about $1.5 billion to replace of some kind. This is a country that's operating under almost austerity conditions in terms of the federal government.
Yes, this is true. Well, also, it takes 1/4 of the space shuttle program out of existence. There's only 4 of those spacecraft. And we may decide that this is the time to start looking at the follow-on manned spaceflight program. I don't think anyone is going to suggest that we stop the space program. I don't think they're going to suggest that we stop the manned spaceflight program. But they're going to have to reorient this program. One thing that most people haven't talked about yet is our entire space program, the military as well as civilian, was going to depend on that space shuttle.
Yeah, we had all of our eggs in that basket.
All the eggs, including our Star Wars. Our Strategic Defense Initiative was going to plan on that.
Which is the next point that I want to raise. Don't you think that the critics of President Reagan's SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, the Star Wars program, will now have an open book from which they can criticize the president's plans to put that kind of a space defense out there?
Well, they will have a position here. They can criticize it because it's like anything that's on the edge of technology. Something can go wrong. And I don't think, though, that this will really stand up because, as I say, we have to go ahead. Remember, the Soviet Union is developing a space shuttle of their own. It looks almost exactly like this space shuttle. And will they stop? I don't think so. It's just going to require a real close examination of how we're going into space. And we're going to have to shift, for instance, the Defense Department will probably have to shift back to expendable vehicles until this problem is solved, so that we can keep our security programs going.
Do you know whether the Defense Department had some crucial missions planned for its own part of the space shuttle program that will now obviously have to be deferred?
It'll all depend on how long it is delayed. Well, they definitely had some very high priority programs planned. There's no question about that. And, you know, they also had anticipated there would be problems with the Space Shuttle program, or either in scheduling or reliability problems, because they set up their own expendable launch vehicle program, which is now going through Congress getting approved. I'm sure they'll accelerate that so that they can continue with their particular spacecraft.
Mr. Baker, thanks very much for joining us today.
Certainly, thank you.
All right, the editor-in-chief of Defense Daily, that's a publication of Space Publications Incorporated, talking about the cold, hard political and economic realities now of the space program in the United States as a result of this tragedy today. John Palmer, Studio 3K in New York. John?
Thanks, Tom. You have raised there, and all day questions have been raised about what happened. Certainly, primary focal point, the fate of the 7 people aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. What happened? Why did it explode a minute and 15 seconds? Well, a lot of these questions, all of these questions, are going to be put to NASA administrators and associates down at Cape Canaveral less than an hour from now at 3:30 Eastern Time, when they will hold a news conference and at least answer all the questions they can at that particular time. Earlier this month on the NBC Today program, Bryant Gumbel interviewed Krista McAuliffe, the private citizen astronaut aboard the Space Shuttle, the first private citizen and a teacher. They talked about how she felt and so forth. We have that tape now. We'd like to show it to you. It begins with the ceremony and remarks from Vice President George Bush when he announced that she was going to be the first private citizen to go up on the shuttle.
And the winner, the teacher who will be going into space, Krista McAuliffe. Where's Daddio? Krista teaches in Concord High School in Concord, New Hampshire. She teaches high school social studies. She's been teaching for 12 years. She plans to keep a journal of her experiences in space.
It's not often that a teacher is at a loss for words. I know my students wouldn't think so. I've made 9 wonderful friends over the last 2 weeks. And when that shuttle goes, they might be one body. But there's going to be 10 souls that I'm taking with me. Thank you.
Those 10 souls, of course, belong to Krista and the 9 other finalists who competed for that one special seat reserved for a teacher on next January's shuttle flight. Krista McAuliffe has joined us here this morning. Congratulations.
Thank you very much, Bryant.
Simple question. Why you?
It's really hard to say. There were 10 people. We were such a cohesive group, enthusiastic, really enjoying teaching, and I think any one of us would have done a really good job. I don't know what put me over the top, and I'm delighted to be here.
When you first applied for this, did you think you had even a prayer?
I really didn't. I was almost doing it kind of like when you play the lottery. If you don't play it, you don't win.
Sure.
And when I filled out that application, that's really how I felt. I figured there'd be at least 50,000 people across the country who would be slipping that into the mailbox around the same time.
What about when you made it down to the last 10? Did you think then, maybe?
Well, then the possibility became very real, and I really started to think what the impact would be on my teaching career and on my family. Yeah. But it was still really exciting.
Has it all hit you yet?
No, I don't think so. I still can't believe that I'm going to actually be going into that shuttle. It just really doesn't seem possible. Maybe when I'm on the launch pad, it will.
What are you most excited about?
Seeing the Earth from that perspective of that small planet, you know, it's such a big place here, but being able to look at it from a new perspective, and I hope I can bring that wonder and that excitement back to the students.
Maybe just a little bit of fright, too?
Not yet. Maybe when I'm strapped in and those rockets are going off underneath me, there will be, but space flight today really seems safe. We had a good example of that when NASA shut down the last one through the computer because one of the backup systems wasn't working.
You say it seems safe. A lot of people equate that with it also seems boring. Have you been one, have you been one who followed NASA efforts all along, long before?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I can remember watching the Vanguards as they went like this, and I remember Alan Shepard's first suborbital flight, and it was really thrilling.
I read where you said you wanted to demystify space. In plain talk, what does that mean?
Well, we see the space program as a science or math or technological adventure right now. I want the students to get a little bit of ownership. I want them to feel that they're part of the space age because they're the future and their children or grandchildren are going to be pioneering that. So I really hope to bring an ordinary person's perspective to this.
Have you heard from some of your students yet?
Yes, I have. They've been dropping by the house, they've been sending me cards, they've been calling. That's been super.
NASA, of course, has a selfish interest in all this. I mean, they want to build up public support for the huge outlays that are necessary to keep the program going. As part and parcel of being the first ordinary citizen, I mean, are you expected to be the ordinary speaker who's out there making speeches on NASA's behalf all along?
That's going to come. Certainly will, but I'm also delighted that the teaching profession and students and the whole country is really going to benefit from this. We hopefully are going to know an awful lot more about what life is like aboard the shuttle.
Yeah. You go up on January the 22nd.
That's what the date is, yes,
of 86,
right now.
and we're hoping that that'll be met. What are you most concerned about between now and then?
Well, probably just getting my life in order. I do have a family in Concord, New Hampshire, and I have to get them set. I also want to make sure my replacement in school is going to be comfortable for next year.
Any thoughts, however slight, that you might not measure up once it gets going?
Well, one of the things that has been really surprising is all of the publicity, and I was saying to my husband the other night, it's almost like I'm reading about somebody else, you know?
Well, it's a dream come true for you.
Oh, it certainly is.
Krista McAuliffe, congratulations.
Thank you again.
Good luck. We'll see you in January.
Thank you.
We'll take a break here. This is Today.
The first private citizen astronaut, Krista McAuliffe, there in an interview, a tape-recorded interview with Bryant Gumbel on the Today Show some weeks ago, talking about how proud she was to have been chosen to be a part of this space shot, this tragedy. It's all but now impossible to think that she could have really survived the crash today, the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger, along with 6 of the astronauts, 7 altogether aboard the shuttle. Let's go back now to Washington and Tom Brokaw.
John, it was such a poignant interview. You can see why she was so appealing and attractive to NASA. She was outgoing and enthusiastic, and of course she talked with great enthusiasm about the confidence that she had in the space agency itself. Today, that moment of triumph came for her and ended very shortly after liftoff, about 1 minute and 15 seconds, that enormous explosion, and as you indicated, no survivors. Krista McAuliffe and 6 other astronauts appear to have perished in that gigantic fireball about 5 miles up in space, 1 minute and 15 seconds after liftoff today. Dan Molina is at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas now, where he's been keeping track of what information he can gather there. Dan?
Tom, no new information. I must say it seems so sad and strange to glance up at some of the information readouts that we get from NASA here. There's an indication, MET, mission elapsed time. That's the time that the mission would have lasted had it gone on. Oh, you can see it on your screen there. 3 hours, 12 minutes, 16, 17, 18 seconds. That's the amount of time that the mission would have lasted had it not ended in the terrible, terrible tragedy this morning. And I must echo John's observation. It seems all but impossible now to look back to this morning when we were talking about ice problems, little problems, something that NASA has been so cautious about, little problems all the way along the line. And this morning, though, it looked like those little problems were going to be overcome. We saw a very happy crew. First thing this morning, you just saw Krista McAuliffe. There's the crew with their traditional breakfast, the cake in front of them. Everybody ready to go this morning. They had glitches along the line, but this morning there was that attitude like today we were going to get off the launch pad. We're ready to go. NASA's ready to go. We had an extra hour of sleep, I know they were thinking. They were delayed about an hour because there was a problem with an electronic fire detector that was on the pad itself. No indication that that electronic problem had anything to do with the accident today. There is Krista McAuliffe parading out with her fellow crew members, Ellie Onizuka giving a wave as they go into the elevator that would take them to the van that would then take them out to the launch pad. 7 members on this crew, a very experienced crew, being applauded there. Dick Scobie leading the way, mission commander. Judy Resnick behind him, Ron McNair, Mike Smith, all of them headed out to the launch pad, confident that today would be the day. We're going to go, they said earlier on today, headed for the van that would take them out to the launch pad. It was a very, very clear, very, very cold morning at the Cape today. We were talking about ice problems earlier on. There was the chance, if they lifted off with icicles around the shuttle, that one of those icicles might break off and damage the heat protection tiles. That would pose a hazard to re-entry, and so they were worried about that. They delayed because of that problem for some time. But there is, again, no connection between anything that could have resulted from that and the tragedy today. This is Krista McCullough putting on a vest that is full of life-preserving equipment should the shuttle land on the water. There is always that contingency that they plan for, as they plan for any number of them. That vest has a life preserver in it that could keep an astronaut afloat for some 24 hours, food and things like that. That's one of the contingencies that they plan for. There are ways that they can get out of that hatch and swing down into the water if, in fact, they were to land on the water. That contingency is one of several, as I say, that NASA plans for including the landing at one of several overseas landing sites. We were all very aware of the possibility of that some missions ago when a sensor indicated that a main engine had shut down on the shuttle. It turned out that it was the sensor's fault, not the engine's fault. Everybody was very scared about that, and we became very aware at that point of the possibility of something serious happening to the shuttle. People who are close to the program, astronauts all the time, say something's going to happen serious one day. But as you have pointed out, Tom, so many times this morning, and as so many observers have pointed out, it's become part of our lives. How could something happen to something that's as fun and as glamorous as the space shuttle? Well, today, obviously, it did a tragedy of enormous proportions, Tom.
Thank you very much, Dan Molina. As we indicated recently, there's been a lot of attention about journalists going into space. Walter Cronkite appearing in space regalia on the front page of some newspapers and in magazines as well. Any number of us have applied to NASA, to a special screening committee that they have organized to see if we could be the first journalist to go into space as well. Obviously, the future of the journalist in space program remains very much up in air as well as the future of the space shuttle program. Someone who has watched all of this since the inception, and an original member of the Right Stuff group, was Deke Slayton. You'll remember him, one of the original astronauts who could not fly because of a heart murmur, later was able to go into space, now involved in a private space enterprise, hopes to launch communication satellites and others as well. He's with us now from Houston, Texas. Mr. Slayton, as you watch those videotape replays of what happened today, could you get any indication at all through the naked eye what may have gone wrong?
No, not really. I could just speculate like everybody else. If I had to speculate, I'd say it's probably a 90% probability something with the main engine, since they just did clearance to throttle up, and usually things fail when you're in a transient state. Everything else was apparently stable, so if I had to hazard a guess, I'd say that would be the high probability, but that could be totally wrong, and it'll take a lot of numbers crunching and data analysis to really sort it out.
Given the enormity of that fireball and what appeared to be the devastating effect of that on all of the equipment that may have been on board, will we ever know, do you think?
That's a good question. There's a lot of telemetry available, of course, and that'll be available to analyze from the records, and hopefully they'll sort out the precise cause. But we've had similar situations before, obviously without crews on board, where we didn't know the precise cause of an accident, and we did what we call a shotgun fix. We fix everything that could have caused it, and the system continues to work. We did that back in the Atlas program in Mercury.
Mr. Slayton, we've all been talking about the space shuttle program as if it's a routine shuttle flight from Washington to New York, talking about putting not just congressmen and senators up, but now school teachers and maybe even journalists in the future. Have we all become too sanguine about what can happen in space with these enormously complex vehicles?
Yeah, I think so. I think, as noted many times earlier, NASA's a victim of its own successes here, and people have begun to accept anything that NASA does is guaranteed to work, and fortunately it has up to this point. But all of us in the business recognize that it's still high technology and there's some risk associated with it, and sooner or later you're going to have a failure. Nobody ever built the perfect machine yet, and the shuttle certainly isn't, but it's still a very good machine. I'm confident they'll sort the problem out, and we'll press on with the program. You learn from your mistakes.
I'm not asking you to be unduly critical of your old agency, but do you think that NASA was too public relations oriented in getting civilians to fly on the shuttle?
Well, my opinion has always been nobody should ever fly in a space flight that doesn't have a good reason to be on. It's still not at the stage where you're going to haul people along for a joyride. It's not for me to evaluate the importance of each crew member on each flight. And certainly there's some merit in having a teacher on board this one in terms of fostering education in the country, particularly the science and technology related education. And so it's not for me to judge whether that was worth the sacrifice or not. That'll take history to do that. But I don't believe anybody should go that doesn't have a good, solid reason to be there.
You're a kind of competitor of NASA now. You're involved with a private program that hopes to launch its own set of satellites from private enterprise and so on. Do you think that the United States has invested too much of its space resources in the shuttle program? That is, that we've got too many eggs in that one basket?
Well, no, not really. We're not a competitor in a very strong sense. We're dealing in a different segment of the market, but as far as the bigger payloads are concerned, that is true. The country has made a big investment in the shuttle, and that's considered to be the wave of the future, primarily because one envisioned being a reusable system that would be cheaper and more economic, and obviously things will happen in space faster if transportation up there is cheap. But there is a potential single-point failure there if this turns out to be a generic-type problem that requires shutting the whole fleet down for a year or so, which is not impossible. You know, we'll have a serious problem, and I think it probably would be wise to have a backup capability in this country, a launch capability, and that's what the old expendables, which are considered obsolete, can still provide you for many, many missions. So I still think the country needs to carry an expendable capability along with the great things the shuttle can do.
What was your immediate reaction, Dick Slayton, when you saw that videotape of the explosion today? Personal?
Well, it caught me not totally by surprise because I knew the thing had happened. So I was just looking to try to detect, if possible, what might have failed at what point. And that was my prime interest in watching it.
Did you know any of the astronauts on board?
Pleasant sight.
Did you know any of the astronauts on board?
Oh, yeah, I knew them all. Yeah, I worked with them and knew them all very well.
And you've been at this business a long, long time, both as a pilot and as an astronaut. Do you ever get in a mindset that you can deal with the emotional impact of something like this?
Well, sure. I've been doing it for about 45 years, so you don't ever get to the point where you enjoy it, but you got to learn to cope, and this is what goes with progress. Flight has always been a risky business. It'll always be risky, particularly the front end of it. And some things go wrong nobody has any control over, and when it happens, you've had a bad day, and you press on and make the best of it. And unfortunately, that's what happened here, but we'll learn from the problem and fix it and get on with it.
Dick Slayton in Houston, thanks very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
I want to remind all of you that some stations now may want to cut away from our continuing coverage of this tragedy, the explosion on board the shuttle Challenger today. You may want to return for your local programming. However, NBC News will continue its continuous coverage of this national tragedy here today. And what we want to do now is show you once again what happened today in the skies over Florida, just out over the Atlantic Ocean at about 1 minute and 15 seconds after liftoff of the Space Shuttle Challenger with 7 people on board.
4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up. 1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Those are the parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, the parents of Krista McAuliffe. It appears at this point they don't know what has happened, but others, of course, realize that something seriously has gone wrong. in slow motion now. To my eye, at least, it appears that the entire external tank just came apart and became one gigantic fireball. It would have been, at that point, a bomb. To the right, you see the solid rocket booster peeling off. It appears that it was that big fuel tank that we see attached to it, the largest part of the shuttle program, that just seemed to come apart. And, of course, it is chock-a-block with volatile oxygen and hydrogen to fuel the main engines. The parents, Ed and Grace Corrigan, as they were watching that, didn't quite know what to believe as we looked at them. And, of course, this was their first launch, and as they looked at it, it appeared that there may have been a second booster going off one kind or another. But, unfortunately, that was not the case at all. In Concord, New Hampshire, where Krista McAuliffe was a school teacher, the entire community was involved, as you might expect. Her third grade class was at Cape Canaveral today with a large banner watching that tragic scene. The banner said, "Go, Krista, go." And at a high school auditorium, there were about 1,500 students assembled so that they could watch on television. Here are the kids.
4, 3, 2, 1.
The successful liftoff, lots of celebration. But then something is wrong.
Would everybody please go back to class at this time?
They were immediately sent back to their classes, stunned, as we all were, by what had happened. But a much closer personal attachment to at least one member of that shuttle crew, Krista McAuliffe, a school teacher in the community of Concord. The ebullience of high school students drained from them as they watched on television screens as the shuttle blew up today. Sharon, Krista McAuliffe, and 6 other astronauts apparently have died in that gigantic fireball explosion. The crews continue to search the ocean with a variety of vessels and airborne vehicles, helicopters, and Coast Guard cutters are out there. They were kept from the area for some time because of the debris. Jay Barberie is a veteran reporter on these space programs. He's been down in Cocoa Beach, Florida since the very beginning of the space program. He was there today and he watched all of this as well. Jay?
Well, it was something that you didn't want to see, Tom. We were watching it as it took place into a blue sky, and we were watching it as it happened. Of course, when we saw it, we knew what had happened, but we just didn't want to believe it. And now the recovery forces are hard at work 18 miles east of here, trying to find what is remaining, the remains, rather, of Challenger and the crew.
Jay, no word whatsoever, I gather, from the NASA officials who are still assembled there. They're giving you no indication, and we expect, what, a press briefing in about 20 minutes or so?
That's correct. We will have the top officials here, and at that time, we should know what has been taking place since the Challenger went down. But as now, there's only speculation and only looking at the videotapes, and we know the recovery crews are out there. What they've found, we do not know, but we should know shortly.
What happened to Krista's husband and children and her parents? Do you know, where were they taken?
Well, they were, of course, escorted by NASA personnel, and I'm sure that they were taken back to the astronaut quarters, which is only a couple of miles from here, and I'm sure they're in seclusion there.
And as you looked at that videotape, as we looked at it together, what was your judgment, Jay? You've watched a lot of these go up, of course, and you've not seen anything quite like this before. But did it appear to you, as it did to me, that it could have been the external tank that went first?
I don't think there's any question about it, Tom. I think you're absolutely correct. It was the external tank. Now, the question is, when they told him he was go for throttle up, he increased the throttle pressure, increased the thrust on the 3' engines. The question is, was there a flare back of the engines at that time? If there was a flare back, this could have erupted the external fuel tank. There could have been any kind of eruption of the ducts leading the hydrogen and the oxygen into the engines. But it occurred at the base of that tank without question. Why it occurred, of course, is the question.
Is it conceivable, and again we point out that this is only speculation on our part, but is it conceivable that it might have been weather related, that there was ice forming, of course, at the base of the main engine earlier in the day? Is it possible that ice may have played a role in all of this?
It's very possible. A chunk of ice off of the external fuel tank itself could have ruptured the ducts leading the fuel from the tank itself into the main engines. Another possibility are the wind currents at maximum Q. At that time, in the position that the spacecraft was in, the wind, the current there could have had something to do with the flare back of the engines. No one really knows. There's a lot of things that you can speculate about, but what we do know, Tom, without any question, that explosion occurred in the external fuel tank where 500,000 gallons of fuel was located. That thing is 15 stories tall, so if you can imagine a 15-story tall building, something holding 500,000 gallons of fuel, then you can imagine what sort of explosion that happened.
All right, we want to show once again on the model that we have here in our Washington studios just what we're talking about. This is the space shuttle itself. This is the vehicle. This is the Challenger, and it is attached to all of this propellant. These are the solid rocket boosters on either side. They develop 1 million pounds of thrust apiece, and as Jay indicated to you, in this large external tank, which originally was painted white, and then they removed the paint because they determined they didn't need it and they wanted to save the weight. This 15 stories high altogether, filled with oxygen and hydrogen, and it fuels the main engines, which are located at the very base down here of the shuttle Challenger, and the other shuttles for that matter as well. They're used on liftoff, and then they're used as well to get them into orbit. Then they're fired up once again when they come back into the Earth's atmosphere. You remember that phrase, MECO, that's main engine cutoff. They fire them up to about 65% on liftoff, then they go to 104% or even higher if they need to go into the orbit itself. And it was just at that point when they went past 65%, past 100%, full throttle, shortly after that, that this appeared to just break into flames. And then, of course, we saw that large fireball. So the indications are, at the outset at least, that it happened somewhere in here, possibly in these ducts. And as Jay Barbary indicated, there are ducts that lead from the external tank here back into the main engines. That's where it may have occurred. There's always the possibility that a number of other things could have happened as well that then triggered all of this fuel that is contained there. At any rate, it's like a giant rocket going off, a Roman candle, if you will, with 2 on each side and a much larger one in the middle. And people positioned right up here, 7 of them all together today, with no means of getting out of there once they have launched. That is, that there is no escape hatch of any kind, no ejection seat. And based on what we saw today, there was very little to eject from, tragically enough. To remind you, in about 20 minutes, we expect to have a press briefing from the officials at NASA at the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida. We may know more then. Of course, they have a wide variety of data, telemetry of all kinds, signals coming in electronically and otherwise. They'll be looking at that and analyzing it, if in fact they can. The entire country shocked by what we have witnessed here today. I'm sure that we're bond together in our common sympathy for the families of all the people who are involved. And there are grave political and economic questions raised as well. John Dancy is on Capitol Hill now, and he has the reaction of some of the principal players there. John?
Tom, probably no program has enjoyed the kind of support that the space program has enjoyed throughout its history here. Through periods of budget austerity and financial crisis, the space program has continued to enjoy support from many members here. There is no indication that despite this tragedy today, it is going to have any less support. A number of members of Congress, both on the House and the Senate side, have been in the respective press galleries giving their reaction to what happened today. Let's start off with some of it. This was Congressman Manuel Lujan, who is chairman of the House Science and Technology Committee. He was with Dr. Graham, the NASA administrator, when it happened.
We learned that there had been an explosion in the vehicle, and he said, "Oh my God, you know, what a terrible thing to happen," and was very visibly shaken and ran out of the office and went to his office.
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends. Mike Smith, the pilot, was my mother hen the first month that I trained. They assigned him to me, go to my classes and help brief me. And I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident. And so it's been very, very difficult for me this morning.
I don't think that it's time to start examining whether or not we continue with programs, but certainly, at least we ought to take a deep breath and step back before we go ahead with any further manned flights.
Let me be philosophical for a moment. I guess in our human existence there is triumph and there is tragedy. And man tries many things. And we advance as a whole human race because we succeed most of the time. We make advances, whether it's in space or engineering or health or medical things. Sometimes, though, we aren't perfect. And then there's a tragedy that brings us back to our own human frailties and our lack of perfection. And so that's the kind of a day we're faced with now. It's been an amazingly successful series of triumphs through the years. But it also is fraught with the possibility of tragedy, and that's what we came up against today.
Tom, Senator Glenn and Senator Garn, the two senators who have flown in space, will be going with the Vice President in about 15 minutes from now, headed for Cape Canaveral to be there and to console the families who today were struck by this tragedy. Tom?
John, I think that we'll also hear later this afternoon from Congressman Bill Nelson. It is in his district that the Kennedy Space Center is located, and he flew on the most recent of the space shuttle flights as well. We've not yet heard from him today, but are you hearing up there that we could very likely hear from him as well?
Congressman Nelson has scheduled a press conference at about 4 o'clock this afternoon he was on the most recent space flight, as a matter of fact. Came back from it very successfully, very much a booster of the space program, as are most members of Congress, Tom. It is a program that has really enjoyed tremendous success here, even back during the 60s when we were first trying to get to the moon. There was a lot of talk about we ought not to be doing this, we ought to be putting our money somewhere else. But in fact, Congress continued to support it and continues to support the shuttle program. There are, of course, some questions raised for members of the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee. They are going to question what all this means first for the military space program. The military had depended to a certain extent on the space shuttle to launch some military satellites. Of course, there were other expendable rockets that were used for that as well. So in the military, where you have had people who've questioned the value of the shuttle program all along, this is going to add fuel to that controversy. It seems to me that it also raises some questions about SDI, the Star Wars program. When Senator Lautenberg was up here today, he was talking about the fact that you're getting into areas of tremendous high tech here, where you're depending on technological feats which have never been accomplished before. And when you look at something which is, compared to SDI, as relatively simple as the shuttle program, then it has to raise questions in your mind, and it has to give you pause as to whether or not we should be going ahead with the SDI program, whether or not it can, in fact, do all the wondrous things that the administration claims it will do. Tom?
John, my guess is that you're not hearing much learned discussion about the future of the space program today up there. My guess is that members of both the Senate and the House are reacting as the rest of us are, trying to deal with our own emotions as we watch all of this, holding out the slimmest of hope that perhaps one of the astronauts or all of them could have survived, although that seems almost totally unlikely at this time. Are you hearing any real profound discussion about what the program may do?
People here, of course, react in a very human fashion to what's going on. They're just as human as the rest of us in a situation like this, and they were just as stunned as the rest of us by this news. What every senator and every House member has said is that there has to be a pause. NASA must not fly another shuttle until we know what happened. The consensus seems to be that NASA should examine it, that they have the expertise. There should not necessarily be a blue ribbon panel, but that NASA should go ahead now, examine what happens. It is still, to a certain extent, a test program, and in any test program, you are going to expect failures like this. Congress, the reaction from here has been, in that sense, very mature and not hysterical. No one has said, oh, let's call it off because it's just not working.
But there are real financial constraints in the country already, and this This space shuttle that blew up today cost more than $1 billion, probably cost $1.5 billion to replace it. That's going to have an effect, no matter how we feel about it right now, on the entire budget process, isn't it?
Graham Rudman certainly is going to have an effect on NASA because, as one of your guests earlier was talking about, the fact that this is 1/4 of the civilian space program that blew up today. One space shuttle out of 4. That's going to have to be replaced if we are, in fact, to continue at the same level. Graham Rudman, the law mandating cuts in the budget, is certainly going to have an effect on the space program. Will we go ahead and replace that space shuttle, or will we just let it pass and go ahead with 3 at this point?
Thank you very much, John Dancy on Capitol Hill today. We want to remind you once again of what we have ahead of us in about 10 minutes. We expect to hear from NASA officials their first full-blown report since the explosion on board. It appeared to be in the external tank of the Space Shuttle Challenger today about 2 minutes after liftoff, actually a little less than that, somewhere between 1 minute and 2 minutes altogether, at about 5 miles in space, about 18 miles downrange from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. It appeared that all 7 astronauts on board were killed. That includes the 37-year-old schoolteacher, Krista McAuliffe, who was flying as part of the civilian and space program that the Reagan administration launched during the presidential campaign of 1984. The tragedy was witnessed by her husband and 2 small children, as well as by her parents and members of her 3rd grade class from Concord, New Hampshire. Tonight, President Reagan will make a special address to the American people directly from the Oval Office. His State of the Union speech, which had been scheduled for 9 p.m. Eastern Time, now has been postponed until next Tuesday. What time he'll make his speech tonight, we're uncertain at this point. As soon as the White House tells us, we'll, of course, pass that along to you. Mrs. Reagan was watching all of this today, as it turns out, live on television from the private quarters at the White House. Her immediate reaction was, "Oh, my God," and then she, according to a spokesperson, prayed that there would be some survivors of some kind. But to repeat once again, it appears that apparently all 7 on board have perished in that gigantic explosion. I happened to be at the White House for a briefing with Chief of Staff Donald Regan and other correspondents, and Pat Buchanan and Admiral Poindexter, who is the chairman of the National Security Council. When a note was passed to Buchanan and Poindexter, they left the room. We didn't know whether they were leaving prematurely or for what reason, when suddenly someone came back in, handed Don Regan a note, and it said simply, "The shuttle has blown up. Details to follow." And he looked at us, and we were as stunned as he was. And then, of course, that briefing broke up. It was shortly after that that President Reagan, or about that time, that President Reagan was notified. He felt very strongly about the families of all the people who were involved. He watched, as we all did, in great shock, the television replays of that explosion today. Where do we go from here? Where do we go from here as a nation with the space program? Where do we go from here financially and politically? Those questions simply cannot be answered today. But the risk, of course, that we all take in being involved in great enterprises is that human sacrifice of one kind or another will be required, as we heard John Glenn saying a little while ago. The real question that remains to be answered, of course, is, was there some kind of incompetence on the part of those people who are charged with the space shuttle program? I'm only raising it as a question. We do not know the answer to that yet. That will take a long and meticulous investigation before we can determine that. But the American public will be demanding some difficult answers to some difficult questions, and of course we'll all have to examine what it is that we want from this era of high technology. Dan Molina is at Houston. That's at the Johnson Space Center there, where he has been keeping track of what little they know at this time. Dan?
Krista McAuliffe looks every inch an astronaut these days, and her crewmates treat her like one of the gang. This was a little trek up to break the sound barrier with Dick Scobie, her mission commander.
They could have very easily said, "Oh, you know, there's a teacher, what are we going to do with her? She's going to get in the way, or we've got to plan things around her." If I needed help during the lessons, if I needed an extra pair of hands, I mean, they've just been so wonderful. I really do feel part of the crew.
For several months now, doctors have been jabbing and probing her, zipping her up in black bags to see if small dark places scare her. She's gone through all sorts of training in shuttle simulators, and she's learned a few cold, hard facts about what to expect.
I didn't realize it'd be so slippery.
The shuttle's small. And if you kind of think of it as being in maybe a 6-man tent with 7 people in it, and it rains for 6 days, that's the environment that you're in.
It's all a very big change from life in Concord, New Hampshire. This was the day she left home for 4.5 months of training. it seemed especially tough to say goodbye to her daughter, Caroline.
Love you. All right. See you later, alligator.
Okay, let's get dinner ready.
Yes.
Okay.
Life without mother in the McAuliffe household. A new adventure for Krista's husband, Steve, an attorney.
Okay. Frozen cook. Open that thing up.
He's doing a super job. I mean, he took over single parenting without missing a beat. The kids are doing well. He's doing well. I mean, he's doing so well that when I came home the last time, I walked in the kitchen to do something, and he kind of looked and he said, "Excuse me," he said, "we don't do that way anymore." I said, "Pardon me."
She's part astronaut now, but still a teacher first. There's an elaborate plan for her to teach from space and to hook up a direct link with her old school. Much of the country will see this ultimate field trip, and Krista says it's just the kind of recognition teachers need.
And because they feel so good about themselves and the morale is high, I'm hoping that other people are going to look at that and say, they do a very important job.
She'll earn a place in history when Challenger lifts off. She'll be a celebrity for a while. Then it'll all be over. Krista McAuliffe will be back in New Hampshire, back in her classroom, but she'll always be known as the teacher in space. Dan Molina, NBC News at the Johnson Space Center, Houston.
Now, of course, her legacy is tragically different. Vice President George Bush and a contingent directed by President Reagan now departing Washington, D.C. for the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral. John Palmer is standing by in New York, where he has a report for us on the weather conditions that existed this morning at the time of liftoff. John?
Yes, Tom, our meteorologist here in New York, Joe Whitty, has done some checking. It was below freezing down at the Cape for many hours during the night, and it wasn't until about 10 o'clock mid-morning when the temperature rose above 32. The lowest temperature early in the morning just before dawn was 25 degrees, and that, of course, resulted in those icicles on part of the spacecraft and on the booster rockets, icicles that they knocked off and then after a while dismissed that as possibly being any kind of a problem. Another weather thing that is quite interesting, a phenomenon, is the jet stream, which normally, of course, is in the upper part of the United States, but we know of the much publicized cold weather in the last couple of days, and the jet stream dropped down as low as Florida, as low as the area around the Cape there, and winds at an altitude right here of 7 to 9 miles above the launch pad were 100 miles an hour. That's an unusual condition to have the jet stream moving that far into the south. Now, there are, of course, no definitive reports on the fate of the crew, but we all have been saying this afternoon, and it has been very much confirmed from the experts that it's pretty impossible that anyone could have survived that. We will know in about 6 minutes when NASA officials in Cape Canaveral come out and talk to reporters and answer questions. There are some unofficial reports coming to officials and NASA officials at the Cape indicating that they have found even no large pieces of debris, and certainly no sign of life at the impact zone, some 15, 18, or 25 miles off the coast out in the Atlantic from the launch pad. And now let's go to Bob Bazell. Bob?
John, I've been listening to what you were saying about the weather. That it may have been an important factor, but NASA always has a plane that goes up above the launch site to measure the winds at different altitude. And one of the things that they're always concerned about is what they call wind shear, which is a sharp change in the wind direction. It's not so much the velocity at those upper altitudes that matter during a launch. It's sudden changes in the wind direction that cause even more pressure. And has been pointed out many times this morning, the explosion aboard the Challenger occurred this morning at what the engineers call maximum Q, or maximum aerodynamic pressure, when the rockets are being pushed to their ultimate thrust and the greatest amount of stress is put on the shuttle. Now, during the 5th shuttle mission, Commander Vance Brand has said that at that moment he felt like the shuttle was about to fly apart. And some structural changes were made at that point, and they did not allow the rockets to be pushed as far as they might have been for a long time. Now, of course, all of this is speculation. We hope that in a few minutes when Jess Moore, who's the head of the shuttle program, comes down to talk to us from Cape Canaveral in Florida, that we will have our first information from NASA. This is very important because as long as we continue to speculate. But looking at the tape, it does appear that it occurred at a time when Dick Scobie, the commander, pushed to maximum thrust. There was a physical event going on at that moment. And to recap something that I said earlier, several hours earlier, we've been talking for a long time, and I think it's especially poignant right now. that Commander Scobie did tell me several times, as a matter of fact, because this was something that we talked about, that someday a shuttle was going to blow up. He said he had been a test pilot, he had been a Vietnam veteran, much decorated for combat missions in Southeast Asia, and he said that there was no question in his mind that someday a space shuttle would explode. He said it was a complex piece of machinery, a lot of explosives. You have to remember that you have to have enough rocket thrust to get 17,000 miles an hour to go into orbit. Hundreds of thousands of pounds of explosive fuel. And someday this complex piece of machinery was going to fail, just like inevitably, if you have enough airplane flights, one of those airplanes is going to crash. So that happened. And he said that he certainly hoped that the shuttle program didn't come to an end. Now, I think that that is not going to be the case for a while. There's certainly going to be a postponement in the shuttle program because, as other people pointed out this morning, it has always been NASA's policy when there's even the slightest glitch not to fly again until anybody discovers what caused that glitch. So here we have obviously a much more serious situation. It's going to take extremely complex analysis. The engineers at several locations around the country are now beginning what they call failure analysis. That is, to try to recreate the accident as best they possibly can, both from the videotapes and from what's called the telemetry. That is the information that's being sent by all sorts of automatic devices on the spacecraft. And when they try to recreate that, they'll try to find what the failure was. And until, the one thing we can say for certain is, until that is understood, and until somebody can say what caused that accident, there will never be another shuttle flight. Now, it could be very soon. It could be that it was a fairly simple failure and something that can be replaced, or it could be because of the nature of the vast explosion that it'll be a long time until it'll be found. But right now we just don't know, and we're looking forward to hearing from Jess Moore at Cape Canaveral any time now.
Bob, we can go back certainly to January of 1967. That was the last time there was loss of life with the American space program. That was the fire aboard the capsule of the Apollo when astronaut Virgil Grissom and 2 other astronauts lost their lives that tragic night when that fire occurred. But it's, I think, worth noting that it was some 18 months before they launched again. So that might give us some idea of the kind of investigation, the kind of work, the kind of painstaking care that's going to be involved here in trying to find out what went wrong. Now, in about a minute and a half, excuse me, Bob?
Yeah, we've just gotten word here at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory that the press conference has been delayed for half an hour, and we can expect it to start at 4 o'clock Eastern Time. To continue on along that point about the Apollo accident, one of the things that in people talking about the history of the space program have always said that the Apollo program, the rush to get a man on the moon, had proceeded in a way that wasn't the best way until that accident. And in fact, it was that accident and the 18-month delay that you talked about made NASA reconsider its entire approach to manned spaceflight. And many people said that many of the successes that followed never would have been possible if it hadn't been for that terrible tragedy. Now, we have a situation here, obviously, where the same kind of extensive analysis will have to go on again. But one of the things that was part of the space shuttle program was redundancy. That was, there was at least 2 of everything that was needed for a safe flight. And so it could not have been a simple failure that caused this thing, a simple failure of something that was necessary. It was more, it was what engineers call a catastrophic failure. Several things had to go wrong at once. And from the looks of those tapes, that was certainly the case.
Very much, Bob Bazell. This is Tom Brokaw back in Washington, and John Palmer in New York, if you'll both just stand by there, as we all will throughout the day. It is now coming up on 3:30 Eastern Standard Time. We want to remind our local stations along the way that if they want to return to their local programming, now is the time to do that. NBC News, of course, will continue its coverage of this tragedy involving the Space Shuttle Challenger and what appears to be the deaths of 7 astronauts on board, including teacher Krista McAuliffe. We'll continue our coverage here right along the way. We want to tell you as well that on Capitol Hill today there was the same kind of shocked reaction that we've all had across the country. House Speaker Thomas P. Tip O'Neill went to the Speaker's microphone in the well of the House of Representatives, and he offered his comments on what we've all been through.
These wonderful people, Francis Scobie, Michael Smith, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Alison Onzikuka, Krista McAuliffe, Gregory Jarvis, died performing their duty. They died not as individuals of a crew, but working as a team, united in devotion and a commitment to the United States, their country. This afternoon, We are united in the same spirit as the crew. Oh, our deep feeling for them. We pray for these brave Americans, for their families.
House Speaker Thomas P. Tip O'Neill talking about the deaths of the astronauts. There's been no official confirmation of that, but of course it's important to indicate that we all believe that there was no way that they could have survived that enormous explosion that was described to Roy Neal earlier in the day as the size of a small nuclear charge. It appears that the large external tank just blew up. The commander of this mission, as Bob Bazell indicated a few moments ago, was Francis R. Richard Scobie, a 46-year-old commander, member of the astronaut corps, veteran of Vietnam, talked to Bob about the dangers inherent in any space shuttle flight. And recently he was asked whether it was a good idea to put a civilian on board like Krista McAuliffe.
There ought to be some return on the investment, because it's not cheap to fly people in space, and it's not undangerous. It's not, you know, it may look that way, and we do these flights repetitively, and they get kind of a commonplaceness to them that's really not there, because each one of them is an individual technological marvel in itself, and you lose that by watching so many of them. There are a lot of things that go on during a space flight, and it's not easy to do, and it may look easy from the outside. It's not easy from the inside. And so you ought to be sending people like this that are going to make a return on that investment, and it really is an investment in them, so there ought to be a return involved in it, and in this case there is.
Richard Scobie, the 46-year-old commander of the Shuttle Challenger, which blew up today shortly after he sent word back to Cape Canaveral, Roger, go, at full throttle up. Just moments later, the entire spacecraft was engulfed in a gigantic explosion, and debris began to rain down on the Atlantic Ocean. Steve Delaney is at Cape Canaveral now, where he has been with veteran watchers of the Space Shuttle program all day long. We're all left to wait until NASA has something to say, and Steve is standing by now with a veteran space correspondent. Steve? Apparently, we are having audio difficulties once again from the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Steve Delaney is there. We'll ask him to stand by because we'll expect to go back to him before this half hour is out to bring you up to date in about 25 minutes. They've now moved it up a little bit. NASA does expect to have its first formal news conference on what happened today, if they know, in fact, at this point. There has been some indication from people who have been watching that the explosion was so complete that there may be no indication that we can make at this time of what caused the explosion itself. We want to show you, for those of you who are joining us along the way, just what happened as the word spreads across the country about the blow-up of the Space Shuttle program. I remember vividly that moment 19 years ago, of course, when there was the fire on the launch pad that caused the deaths of the 3 astronauts at that time in the Apollo program. They were such familiar names to us, and we had believed that this Right Stuff crew could only do right, but we learned that day that things could go wrong, as we have once again today. Here's what happened today.
We have main engine start, 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly. Engines at 65%, 3 engines running normally, 3 good fuel cells, 3 good APUs. Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles, downrange distance 3 nautical miles. Engines throttling up, 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
The last words.
1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
The NASA commentator continuing. The family, once again, her parents right in the middle of your picture, not sure what has happened. Something terrible has gone wrong. Others realize in slow motion now. The entire external tank just comes apart. A gigantic explosion that no one conceivably could have survived, it seems to all of us. Nonetheless, search crews continue to go over a wide part of the Atlantic where debris rained down. There were Coast Guard cutters and helicopters in that area. It's a routine procedure. Standby. Steve Delaney now is at Cape Canaveral in Florida. That's the Kennedy Space Center, as he was just a few moments ago. Now we are told that his microphone is working. Steve?
Well, let's see if it is. Tom, you were talking a moment ago about being unable to believe that what we were seeing was really what was happening. This is the first time I've been here, and I was just enraptured by the whole liftoff process and did not know until perhaps after some other people had figured out that something had gone terribly wrong. And one of those might have been Tom Boyle of the Tipton Conservative, who's been down here covering this sequence of launches ever since Apollo 11, I'm told, right?
Yes, sir. My first indication personally that it had gone haywire was during the pitch over, when it's the smoke trail gets in the way, is that the solid exhaust tends to get dimmer and dimmer, and then all of a sudden it was brighter, which was the evidently an explosion, and I thought, that's not right, and then I saw then I saw the solids out to each side, and I thought, uh-oh, our TLS says hang on to them till they burn out, and then
but
shortly
you knew that
after
something
that,
at that point was out of sequence, and then bits and pieces began to fall through the sky, and you were...
When I saw the pieces, I knew as far away as I was that something was wrong. Evidently it was about 13 miles slant range.
Of all the times that you have come down here, do you always have, at the point where they're getting off the ground and heading for space, do you always have the nagging feeling that something like this might happen?
Yes, especially on the first shuttle, first flight of Columbia, that nobody really knew what it was going to be like, and anyway, that I was fixed at watching the climb of the vehicle, and you tend to get this little unbalanced feeling as you start looking high in the sky, and I thought it might be off track, but it wasn't.
But this time, what did you file?
I haven't filed completely yet. I called back to the paper and told them what it looked like to me, and they were already seeing what was on TV, because it was, a good hour before you could get through a phone.
Tom, you just watched here a moment ago, and they played the slow motion replay of what happened. You hadn't seen that before. What did that sight do to you?
Well, it confirmed to me that it wasn't the solids, that I could see something in there. I'd have to watch it one or two more times, because also between the tank and the belly of the shuttle, you can sometimes see the forming of a condensation trail, or a contrail like an airliner leaves, and it's just an instantaneous, intermittent thing. And but this time it wasn't condensation, evidently.
There's been some, and we've done nothing but speculate as carefully and as clearly as we can label it, that this or that might have happened. What about the low temperature this morning? In your mind, is that a consideration for them to look at?
To me, it is not, because it's cold to us. But you have to remember that liquid hydrogen's temperature approaches absolute zero. It's 400 and some degrees below zero Fahrenheit.
So the difference between chilly and warm for us doesn't make that much difference then?
I would say not. However, I don't deal in cryogenics.
You are dealing, in fact, so you are going to go to the news conference. And do you expect them to enlighten us much more than what we already know?
Yes.
Or is it too early?
No, they will enlighten us more. They will have some empirical data about how high, how far, how fast, and what came down, and what's out there looking.
Everything except why, perhaps.
Yes, sir.
Well, that comes up in 20 minutes or so, and everybody here and everybody across the country will be following it with great care and interest, as this day, which was supposed to be the accomplishment of a lifetime for one school teacher from New Hampshire and 6 of her colleagues, turned into tragedy. Tom, that's about it from here right now.
Thank you, Steve. And a member of those 6 colleagues, a regular member of the astronaut corps, was a woman by the name of Judy Resnick. She had a PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Maryland. She was the 2nd woman to go into space right after Sally Ride. She was a payload specialist, that is, that she worked in the back, and we're going to be hearing from her in a few moments. But there is this great irony, of course, that it was 19 years ago yesterday that the last deaths recorded in NASA occurred on a launch pad at the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida. That was Apollo 1. They were running some tests at the time, and here are the astronauts who were involved. They were led by Virgil Gus Grissom. It was Lieutenant Colonel Ed White, of course, and Roger Chaffee. And they were taken out and put in the capsule aboard the big Apollo 1 rocket, the Saturn rocket. And it was there that a flash fire occurred, and they were unable to get out, and they were all killed. The burned capsule. We were stunned by that one as well, I remember vividly, because once again, the can-do attitude of NASA left us all with the impression that nothing really could go wrong, that these experts who know things right down to the last digit point, one kind or another, had it all figured out. Well, we learned then that there can be tragedies involved in the space program, but it's been now almost 20 years, actually, since there's been another death. And today, apparently, we've had 7 of them, including a school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, and Judy Resnick, a woman member of the astronaut corps who talked recently with Dan Molina about the presence of Krista McAuliffe on board this flight.
Krista McAuliffe going up is, of course, a major step in the space program. What are your general feelings, individually, about the citizen participant program? I'm sure you think it's a good idea, but can you tell me why?
Well, the Space Shuttle is a national resource, and we career astronauts do the things that we're supposed to do to carry a mission out, to deploy payloads, to retrieve them, to operate experiments. And when we come back, we talk to the public a little bit about what we did, but then we have to go on and train for other missions because that's our goal in life. In the case of Krista or of a participant, she will get an opportunity to participate, obviously, and to see what goes on in the space shuttle, to be a member of the team, and then she can come back and devote some time to talking to people about what it is that we do more broadly. I think it's a complement to what we do as opposed to a replacement for the astronauts talking. I think she can enhance and highlight what it is that we have to say to the public about what we do and bring home a little bit more how important it is, the types of things that we're doing and how they will benefit people back on Earth.
What's it been like having her train with you folks? Has it been smooth, and perhaps has her participation given you any fresh perspectives on yourself? Have her observations or the fact that she's a total novice at all this, has it been of interest to you for any particular reason, any incidents perhaps that have come up?
Krista has been training with us since September, which is a little bit longer than we normally do for other payload specialists who may have some more scientific or space-oriented background. And she has not only developed her own set of procedures that she's going to be doing in space, she has participated in our training to understand what it is we're doing, when we're doing things, how we're doing things, what the environment's going to be like, and she has fit in very well as a member of the team. I think she's going to be very helpful to us. We're hopefully going to be helpful to her, that we can work together to get all of our objectives done in a timely fashion. And I think that we couldn't have picked a better person to do the job.
Oh, that's very good. Have there been any particular incidents that have stuck in your mind, anything that's happened that pointed out the fact that here's a teacher and we're astronauts? Has there been a big distinction between her as somebody from the outside and you folks as people on the inside?
Krista came into this program knowing very little about how we do things on the space shuttle other than what she had learned from being a member of the public who isn't involved in space. And she has come a very long way. She's very well versed on what it is we're doing, how the shuttle operates, what types of things it does, and I think she's become a student herself so that she can then later become a teacher to her students.
Yeah. Are you going to participate in any of that?
All of us are going to be helping Krista with the things that she's doing because it's a pretty well choreographed team effort.
What do you look forward to next, Dr. Resnick? This will be your second shuttle flight. What are your personal ambitions at this point?
Well, this is my second flight, and I'm looking forward to having a third flight right now. That's a short-term goal. And as a long-term goal, I'd like to stay with the space program as long as they want me as an astronaut if I can, and if not, I'd like to stay in some other capacity because I think it's very important.
Judy Resnick, PhD in electrical engineering. She was a friend of mine. I do not hesitate to tell you. I met her on the launch of the first shuttle when she was our mission expert commentator. We maintained a kidding relationship over the years. We once had a bet that I will say to you candidly involved a six-pack of beer on the launch of a shuttle. She won the bet, and I sent it to her enveloped in a dozen long-stem red roses. And she called me and said, Brokaw, I like the six-pack better than I did the roses. A lot of mischief beneath that serious demeanor. Great loss to her family, of course, and a great loss to the astronaut corps. Judith Resnick. Bill Nelson, a congressman from Florida, was involved in the last shuttle mission. He's on Capitol Hill now, where he's meeting with reporters. Well, maybe he isn't. Congressman Nelson, you'll remember, had a successful mission. He represents that district in Florida where the space shuttle program is located. And he went up after several delays and had what I think was a 5-day mission that went quite well. Once they were in space, they launched successfully some communication satellites. And they returned about a day early because they were concerned about the weather conditions for landing based on the meteorological forecast. One more indication of how very careful NASA is in terms of the safety factor. They just don't do anything on a whim. They try to work out as carefully as they possibly can what the conditions are likely to be and what the technology is going to be and what it's capable of doing before they send anyone up in space. Congressman Nelson, of course, was one of those members of Congress who's been very instrumental in promoting the space program. There were those people who thought that he had been chosen for that reason, as well as the fact that he lived in the Florida district where the space shuttle is launched from. NASA is not unaware of the fact that they have to have friends in Congress as well as in the rest of the country because it's an expensive program, and they want to promote it as best as they can. The teacher part of this program, Krista McAuliffe was involved in. They'd hoped to be able to teach other members of upcoming generations about what space may mean to them and that she would be able to conduct the classrooms in space, as you heard Judy Resnick talking about that just a few moments ago. And of course, all that will be put on hold. How this will affect this generation is very hard to know. Maybe Bill Nelson has some thoughts on that. Let's go to Congressman Nelson.
On one of the solid rocket motors. As it turned out, after the scrub, when they ran the system, they found out that it was a faulty sensor, not the hydraulic pressure unit, the HPUs. Had we gone and had it been a malfunctioning APU, it could have been a very bad day. Well, that's why you have the redundancies and the checks. Now, as far as ascent, both of the solid rocket motors, those are the two big ones that look like big candlesticks that are packed with the solid fuel. They have to light off at precisely the same time, or else you could get a cartwheeling effect right at the pad. And then on ascent, if you don't have their performance as is scheduled, or if you don't have the performance of all three main engines, you have all kinds of contingencies. One of the contingencies is to come back around and land at the Kennedy Space Center. Another contingency, if you lose one engine, is to go on and land in Dakar, Senegal, or Morone, Spain. Another contingency, if you've got enough energy, is to go once around and come back to Edwards. But where there is an explosion, such as occurred today, there are no contingencies, and that's part of the risk that is taken. No. I couldn't hear you.
Is it possible, did anyone discuss with you any of the dangers dependent upon uneven fuel burning, scenes of the SRBs, that sort of thing might lead to explosion?
No. As our professional NASA.
Congressman Bill Nelson of Florida, who just recently completed a successful mission talking about the escape and emergency procedures that are built into any shuttle launch program. And of course, He concluded by saying, when you have an explosion of the magnitude that we had today, there's nothing that you can do. Roy Neal remembers the investigation that followed the fire on the pad on Saturn I back in 1967, I guess it was, Roy, 19 years ago yesterday. What do you remember about the investigation and what NASA was able to learn?
Well, I remember this, Tom. It was a very long time ago, but the Apollo 1 fire brought to the attention of the nation the fact that they had a space program that was, if you will, based on feet of clay. As a result, they conducted the most sweeping investigation in the history of United States technology. There was much breast beating, much brow beating, but in the final analysis, NASA decided that it had to redesign its entire spacecraft, go to an entirely new oxygen system, if you will, before they could fly again. I'm not suggesting that this may take a total redesign of the space shuttle. There have been too many successful flights to date, but what I am suggesting is that right now, a NASA team, probably what they call a blue ribbon panel, but in this case with the top engineers, the top scientists that NASA can command, is being put together. We may even hear some announcement of that when NASA comes to the fore with a news conference now expectable in just about 7 or 8 minutes. I wouldn't be at all surprised if they announce at that time that a committee has been named by NASA from within itself to conduct an equally sweeping investigation. And it could be that before they're finished, the space shuttle may have to go through some redesign factors, but the likelihood right now, based on research being conducted at this minute at the Marshall Space Flight Center and here in California out at the Rocketdyne Division and the Space Divisions of Rockwell, based on that, the likelihood is that the problem this time is a far smaller signature, is far less in import than the one that caused the Apollo 1 fire, but it will be totally investigated. We can expect such a committee to be named, and shortly, and I'm sure that we, the public, will probably know more about what really did happen, thanks to the telemetry beamed down from space, probably know more than any of us can really handle in the not too far distant future. Analysis is going on now, Tom.
Thank you very much, Roy Neal, at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena today. That's the only experience that we've had, of course, with a tragedy of this magnitude. There have been problems along the way. Here's a kind of a chronology now of the major problems during previous missions in the shuttle program. You'll recall back in April of 1981, the first launch, the first critical test flight of the space shuttle launch attempt was halted in the final seconds. We all remember that. It was delayed for 2 days by those computer software problems. And then in November of 1981, on the second shuttle, a fuel cell failed, limiting power supply and forcing the mission to be cut short by a couple of days. In March of 1982, bad weather forced a 1-day delay. February of 1984, 2 satellites deployed smoothly from the spacecraft, but they failed to reach their proper orbit. This is a big part of this space shuttle program. It's a kind of space airliner and space truck all at the same time. What NASA is doing is carrying into space private enterprise, in effect, launching satellites for companies like RCA, for example, also conducting some pharmaceutical experiments for pharmaceutical companies in the weightless environment that exists up there. What they hope to do is to have a kind of synergy, if you will, between the federal government and the space program and private enterprise. They expected that the shuttle program would pay its own way, that you would hire the shuttle so that you could carry out these experiments. And they had hoped by now to be having a launch a week. Well, of course, that was cut way back. They expected maybe they could have at least 15 launches in this year, and that was quite ambitious. That is unrealistic at this time. There's some question about whether we'll have any more launches for the balance of this year because of the nature of the investigation that will be required. We want to show you some of the training films of the crew that was involved in this shuttle Challenger launch today. What astronauts go through. A lot of people think it's a pretty glamorous business. You sit around in the pilot's lounge until it's time to strap up and then take off. Well, it's not that at all. It's a rigorous, demanding profession that involves a lot of the sciences, physics and otherwise, and also it's a demanding physical regimen. That is, that they put in long days going through the various procedures. There's Krista McAuliffe, who was the school teacher. She was on a consolidated program, of course, preparing for this flight. Most NASA officials said, well, if you're in pretty good physical condition and you're generally alert, that you can get through this all right.
Is this brown or black?
It's brown.
It's brown.
This is your stuff.
Ellison Onizuka, who was there with her, as you can see in the background, the first Japanese-American to go up.
He doesn't know what that's.
He was scheduled to launch in '84, but he couldn't do that then. That's Judy Resnick that we just heard from her, looking very serious. But as I say, there was that mischievous side to her as well. Gregory Jarvis, payload specialist. That is people who work with that big Canadian arm in the background. Now they're gearing up. They get into all of this paraphernalia only for the takeoff. Then when they're in space, they're able to live pretty comfortably, actually, within the confines of the space shuttle itself. As Bob Bazell indicated earlier, the toilet is kind of tricky to operate. But all the indications were that everything was going to go okay.
Which continent am I plugging to?
Let's see.
Ronald McNair is the black astronaut. He's a magna cum laude graduate of North Carolina A&T and a presidential scholar. He's one of America's first 4 black astronauts.
Try to keep us informed of where you are in the timeline also.
I've been in the cockpit of one of the space shuttles. What you do is crawl down into it from on top. It's relatively confined, but once they get up there again, as I indicate to you, they can move around a little bit, although for a 5 or 6 day period, it's close quarters. That is Krista McAuliffe, who's in the foreground here. And I think Gregory Jarvis, who is seated beside her.
It's got that little drawstring so you can tie it off.
Would you like one?
I need. Do you have an extra?
Yes, I do.
Oh.
Teachers are always prepared.
Thank you.
On liftoff, other astronauts have told me before that it's an exciting sensation because there's an awful lot of thrust that is developed, more than 2 million pounds on either side of you with those solid rocket boosters, but it's nothing that the human body can't withstand, even those bodies that are untrained, in effect, to the extreme force of G's. There you can see how close the quarters are. And that's where they were strapped in today, still in place. When the explosion occurred, that it appears to all who have looked at it, killed them all. Mr. McNair, 2 children, and a wife, Cheryl.
Is all the fuse operation in El Segundo?
No, you can request an MS transfer bag, which is like a pouch, the mailman's type bag. Hell, I don't know how strong those knockers are. I wouldn't trust my weight on them.
Get me up there, then I'll lift it.
Communication system in kind of one.
We've just received word that President Reagan will make his address live to the nation tonight at 5 p.m. That's in 1 hour from now, Eastern Standard Time.
I had a terrible set of events. I lived in Boston for 2 years and then went to...
And you just start putting all your stuff on, and then we'll get the whole orbiter configured, and we'll give them each their bags, and then, you know, while they're getting the flight deck ready to go home, and all of us will, you know, the 3 of us.
This is Ellison Onizuka, who is a 39-year-old mission specialist as well. He has 2 children that he leaves behind, we believe. He was a U.S. Air Force test pilot and winner of the Air Force Commendation Medal. Air Force test pilots, of course, are in a high-risk occupation. Nonetheless, no one ever expects this kind of thing to happen. There are generally 2 categories of astronauts, those who entered from the scientific field and those who entered from the Air Force or from the piloting side. Judy Resnick is an example of someone who came in, an electrical engineer. She was intrigued by the electrical challenges that were involved. Some of them also, of course, become both scientists and pilots. In the case of Sally Ride, she became interested in aviation generally. We want to remind our NBC stations along the way that we're going to take a station break now, that NBC News will have continuous coverage of this tragedy involving the Space Shuttle Challenger today, but that those of you who want to return to local programming can do so at this time. Dan Molina now is at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. Dan?
Tom, we, like everyone else at this point, are waiting for Jess Moore, the Associate Administrator of NASA, who is responsible for the Space Shuttle program, to address us all at a news conference to be held at the Kennedy Space Center. They will, of course, try to tell us what they know at this point. Whatever they know, they are getting from the telemetry data, which was coming down all the time. During the launch of the Space Shuttle, there's a constant flow of data to the Mission Control Center here at the Johnson Space Center. That, of course, has been analyzed over the last couple of hours to see what they possibly learn from that. It's not at all certain, as we were saying earlier, that they will ever be able to determine exactly what went wrong, but there is, again, the possibility that the telemetry will show them something. Then there are the incidental factors, the things that could have gone wrong that nobody expected. We were talking about the weather this morning, the ice. There was no indication from NASA this morning that they were ever concerned that the ice would do anything more than pose a threat to the heat protection tiles. They worry that if a shuttle takes off when it's icy cold and there's icicles on it, that one of those icicles might puncture or otherwise damage one of the heat protection tiles, and that would result in some sort of a hazard to re-entry. I was very taken with Jay Barbary's comment earlier on when he said, what about if one of those chunks of ice was to hit one of the lines that runs between the external tank and the orbiter itself? That does, of course, pose the possibility of rupturing one of those lines. The possibilities at this point are endless. We were saying earlier that I have spoken with Max Faget, the designer of the Space Shuttle, widely regarded as the father of the Space Shuttle. He was completely in the dark. He, of course, is watching as close as he can. Dr. Faget is retired from NASA, but he was watching from his office, and he said he has complained several times about any number of things that were involved in the design, but he said at this point there was nothing that we ever predicted could be that serious, that could result in a catastrophic failure. It's one of those things that you write off to possibility, but you can't speculate at this point how it could have happened. We have here a model of the Space Shuttle. For those of you who may not have seen it earlier, it's well at this point probably to review the major components of it. This is the large external tank, and as Tom has pointed out, this external tank contains fuel that amounts to making the shuttle a flying bomb when it goes up into space. On the outside are solid rocket boosters. Now, each of these solid rocket boosters develops a thrust of something like 2.9 million pounds. They separate from the shuttle as it gets to a certain point in the flight. At the point where the catastrophic explosion occurred this morning, they were about halfway to the point where these solid rocket boosters would normally have come off the side of the shuttle and then been picked up at sea, and that is the normal, that's the normal procedure. The external tank goes up with the shuttle further on into space and disintegrates as it comes back down through the atmosphere. We were a little over a minute into the flight. We were at the point where they were approaching what's called max Q. That's the point of maximum dynamic pressure on the orbiter itself, created by the combination of the main engine thrust, 3 main engines down here. Each of them developed something like 375,000 pounds of thrust. That thrust is added to by the 2.9 million pounds that comes from each of the solid rocket boosters. We were approaching the point, as I say, where all of that creates the maximum pressure that is going to occur on the vehicle at any point. The order was given, you go to throttle up, to Dick Scobie, the mission commander, and at that point, the explosion occurred. Now, Tom, I must say I was very, very taken by your reflections on Judy Resnick, and I got a chance to be around her a little bit, and I knew her to be the extraordinary person that you describe her to be. In addition to everything else, she was a concert pianist. Krista McCullough was somebody who I had a chance to be around at some length, and I could tell in being around her why they chose her. NASA was looking, when they selected their teacher, they were looking for somebody who would communicate that enthusiasm, who would be the kind of communicator. They were looking for a PR person to some degree, but they were also looking for somebody to generate the excitement of the fact that, yes, we are crossing over to a new age in space, and the space shuttle is the cutting edge of all of that technology. Our culture is changing to accommodate these changes in technology, and Krista McCullough was somebody who NASA chose to make that point to her students, to all students, and to the American people. She had that quality about her. She had that quality of enthusiasm, plus she had the can-do quality of an astronaut. She never got sick. They took her up several times in what they refer to as the vomit comet, for example. That's that KC-135 aircraft that goes up and does these loops in the sky that are designed to make you sick. They're designed to create that feeling of total, well, it creates weightlessness, but it's also designed to put the astronauts in a situation where they feel that sense of utter helplessness. They're floating around in space, and they often get sick. 50% of them, half of them who have gone up in space have gotten sick. Krista McAuliffe, through all of the training that she went through all of her rides on the Vomit Comet, never got sick. She had a heartiness to her and enthusiasm that showed all the way through all of her training. And she spoke very, very well about the way she was accepted into the program because of those qualities. She didn't try to impose herself. She didn't try to become a star, as she well could have done. And because of that, the astronauts viewed her as one of their own. Even though some of them had some misgivings about the Citizen in Space program, as you heard Deke Slayton say earlier, and Dick Scobie has said several times, that anybody who is going to go into space, any citizen participant, whether it's a teacher or the journalist that they were planning to take up, that person would have to have a reason for being there. They would have to have some good purpose, some return to the nation and to NASA for being up in space. I'm hearing something now coming over our NASA Select Circuit.
You can keep them on until we get into question and answer.
I'm hearing the preparations now for the news conference at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida.
All right.
Tom, it looks like that's coming on us imminently here.
All right, Dan, thank you very much. Dan Molina, who has been following the space program for some time now for NBC News, from Houston and the Johnson Space Program. Across the country, of course, we're all bound together by our common feelings of this national tragedy. This is at Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida. The flag already at half-staff. And the reaction of some people from around New York City.
Solid booster rocket, that right at this point there could have been a tearing when the rocket went into great acceleration, its fastest point. But of course that alluded to this a few minutes ago when they went through full power at about 1.
Well, the only thing I could think about with those kids in that auditorium and the trauma they must be going, and what a shock it must be for them to watch something like that happen to their teacher. That's what I was thinking of.
I think maybe they are doing a little too many shuttles, so I wasn't really that shocked. If you keep going up and going up, there's more reason for error, more room for error.
A shock is it just reminded me of a disaster of previous times, of how the community would react, like the Hindenburg when that went up, and the human tragedy, the loss of life.
I think what bothers you about this is that this represents the epitome of the technology that our country has, and everything that we've ever put into space technology manifests itself in the shuttle program. And for something like this to go wrong, what do? You start from scratch again.
Whenever you hear about something like this, you always have some kind of shock, because you know it's out of the ordinary, and you don't expect things like this to happen.
Once again, Kennedy Space Center, the flag at half-staff today. Of course, more people are killed in regular airplane accidents or in tornadoes, sometimes even in car accidents. And while we're moved by those tragedies as well, we're bound together by this one because we all seem to be attached to the space program in one fashion or another. We have an emotional and a political and even a financial stake in it. And we have such an attachment to the astronauts, and especially to Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher who was representing all the school teachers in the country. And in her own way, she was representing the vicarious thrills for the rest of us, too, by going up there. She was a risk taker with the regular astronauts in hopes that she could advance her knowledge about what goes on in outer space and then share that knowledge with the new generation of young students. Jake Garn, a senator from Utah, recently completed successfully a space shuttle orbital flight of about 1 week, as I recall, altogether. He talked about it today with great feeling in the Senate gallery about his friends.
To what happened today?
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends. Mike Smith, the pilot, was my mother hen the first month that I trained. They assigned him to me. go to my classes and help brief me. And I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident. And so it's been very, very difficult for me this morning.
What does this do to the space program here and its support on the Hill, Senator?
Well, I have great confidence in the space program. I think it's a remarkable system, and I think we should push ahead after we have determined the cause. Obviously, we should not fly until we have determined the cause of this particular failure. But I think we need to look at all of the successes, the remarkable safety record that the space program has had, the benefits that come from it, and the crew members that I knew so well. I would expect that they would want us to go ahead with the space program after we have gone through the proper investigations and analysis and know what happened.
How should we go about investigating this?
Well, obviously, you have to gather all of the data. It has been impounded at this point. There'll have to be a lot of studies, but there are some superbly qualified experts in this area that I think will be able to determine what the failure was.
Senator, you were on board the space shuttle. You felt that tremendous boost that you got. Now, from the telemetry that we heard, the voice data that we heard, they had just told the pilot to go to full throttle, and he had said he was throttling up. What happens at that moment?
You have a combination of the solid rocket booster power and liquid hydrogen and oxygen in the main tank. And because most of your thrust comes from the solid rocket boosters, while you're still in the atmosphere, you can exceed the maximum dynamic pressure. So the main engines are only at about 60% of power until you get further out of the atmosphere. And they had just been given the command to throttle up. And then you go to 104% or maximum power on the solids, or on the liquids. And so that is exactly what had taken place. They were high enough so they would not endanger the orbiter from too much pressure, and were given that order that they could proceed to increase the power.
What are some of the things that can go wrong at that moment?
Well, you have a very large external tank of very volatile liquid hydrogen and oxygen. And you're just simply, it's like in an automobile, you are putting more fuel. You're pushing down on the accelerator. You're putting more fuel to bring more power. And of course, at this point, we don't know whether it was one of the solids. We don't know whether it was the liquid engines or not. There's just no way to know at this point.
Senator, you were the first non-trained astronaut. Missions that NASA had scheduled for this year. Do you think that they were capable of going ahead with 14 or 15 safely?
Yes, I think so. The major problem these last couple of missions has been weather, and that is something that NASA cannot control. But yes, I think the program is mature enough that, and with the opening of the second pad, Pad B, which Challenger was launched from this morning, with 2 pads and also the addition of the 4th orbiter, yes, I think they were capable of that schedule.
Do you think it's going to make any difference to civilians in space from now on?
Well, I can't judge what decisions NASA will make, but my own opinion, again, after the investigations, we should proceed with the program, and that would include the civilians in space program as well.
As a civilian yourself going in, were you adequately warned that something like this could happen?
Oh, of course. The training is very thorough and very adequate. In my own case, having flown more than 10,000 hours, I was certainly aware that there are dangers in flying. However, I still feel very strongly that I'm much safer in flying an aircraft than any day that I'm on the Capital Beltway, and I don't mean that to be facetious at all. We kill nearly 50,000 people a year on the in the highways of this country, because of half of them because of drunk driving. I wish we'd pay a lot more attention to that.
Senator, should there have been some way for them, or was there any way for them to get out at this point? Should there have been?
No, I don't think so. In Columbia originally, during the test phase, when just they were sending 2 test pilots up, they did have an escape capsule. The program had been proved safe enough, in my opinion, that they didn't need them in the other orbiters, and Columbia had been modified so that it did not have the escape mechanism in it. This is purely my opinion, but in watching what happened this morning, I would doubt very much, even if you had had an escape capsule on board or parachutes that it would have been possible to get out with that kind of an explosion in any event.
Senator, in light of all of the delays surrounding recent shuttles and this one, do you think that NASA may have been too anxious to get this one off the ground?
No, I was down on Saturday and for the launch on Sunday morning, and they were criticized on Sunday for being overly careful. Safety has always been foremost in their minds. And we woke up on Sunday morning after having canceled at 10 o'clock the night before to a perfect morning. It was beautiful, sunny, clear blue skies, perfect launch, and there was a lot of talk that rather irritated me. Well, NASA was overly cautious. And so, no, I don't think that's true at all.
What happens in your subcommittee now in terms of funding for the program?
Well, I can't answer that question exactly because of Graham Rudman and the other budget constraints, but I certainly have no intentions other than to push on and that does not change the intent or the progress of the program.
How do you think the investigation ought to be handled, Senator? Should there be some sort of blue ribbon panel put together, or should NASA be allowed to handle it?
Well, I think NASA has the technical experts, and if they need more than in-house, they will pull them in. I don't think we need to go outside that other than to draw on consultants if necessary. NASA is so thorough and so careful. If any of you had experienced how they go through the redundancy and the backups and careful nature, the dedication of these scientists and engineers in NASA, I have full faith in them. They want the program to succeed. They want to take care of their astronauts. It's always a real team effort. They work closely together, and they will want to find out what happened more than anybody else.
Senator Jake Garn, Republican of Utah, who flew successfully in a space shuttle, and as you heard him say today, he had friends on board. This crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger that blew up in space 1 minute and 15 seconds after launch, approximately, about 5 miles up. Apparently, they were all killed. As for the NASA investigation, NBC News Chief White House correspondent Chris Wallace has just told me over the telephone that he is hearing at the White House that NASA will appoint a high official of that agency who is not connected with the Space Shuttle program to head the investigation. Now, NASA, of course, has a number of responsibilities, so there will be a high official of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration who will be heading up this investigation. We have been awaiting an official word from NASA on what happened today and the ultimate fate, of course, of the 7-person astronaut crew. We just now have been informed that that probably will not occur for another 6 minutes or so. They are gathered at the Kennedy Space Center and also at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. Vice President Bush and a congressional delegation that includes Senator John Glenn and Senator Garn, whom we just heard on videotape, headed for the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, where they will be the president's official representatives. The president himself is expected to address the nation, at last we heard, at 5 p.m. today, Eastern Time. That would be in about 41 minutes from now. So apparently he'll come up right after we hear from NASA officials at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. I'm sure that this is all being carefully coordinated. That is, that the White House is on the telephone with NASA officials both in Washington, Houston, and in Florida, finding out just what went wrong, and they'll be sharing that with us as soon as they can. The NASA officials will be. It really is one of the remarkable features of the American space program, as opposed to, say, what goes on in the Soviet Union, that through good times and bad, NASA does talk to the people through the American press. That you'll remember in the early days of the Space Shuttle program, there were some embarrassing moments when we were all there with the cameras trained on the launch pad, and yet there was a computer glitch in the final seconds, and so we had to wait for another full 24 hours and then another 24 hours after that. We saw earlier those tragic pictures of Chaffee, Grissom, and White when they were killed 19 years ago on the launch pad in a fire in a Mercury capsule atop a Saturn rocket as they were preparing for the Apollo space program. So NASA, along the way, has been a very open agency, sometimes very painfully. And we are now told that it will be another 10 minutes before we hear from NASA today at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. That could slip even more for all we know. Let us show you once again, as we have so often today, just what happened. And if I may, I'm just going to borrow this, this model. And it may seem redundant to those of you who have been watching all afternoon long, but there are a number of people who are joining us along the way, so we're going to repeat what we know as best we know it throughout the day here. This, of course, is the space shuttle as it is set up. This is the vehicle itself. The Challenger was set up just like that on the space pad in Florida today, and it launched in that configuration. If we open it up, you'll remember seeing the great bay there. How does it get into space? Well, it gets into space because it is propelled by all of this, really. There are two solid rockets on either side. They develop 1 million pounds of thrust on takeoff, and then they're jettisoned. That is, they peel away and they are parachuted to Earth, and they're recovered in the ocean so they can be used again. This, however, is in effect a kind of bomb. It's a Roman candle taking off, if you will, with a lot of extraneous power. In here, more than 500,000 gallons of liquid oxygen and hydrogen. And that fuels at extremely cold temperatures the main engines, which are located here at the bottom of the vehicle, through some ducts that are located down there. Now, there was some ice that had formed there earlier today. Whether that had anything to do with the problem or not, we don't know. We now want to show you slow motion of what happened today, 1 minute and 15 seconds after takeoff, at about 3 times the speed of sound. There's the shuttle on the bottom. And then, as you can see, a fireball races through the length of the external tank, and there's this enormous explosion. And debris begins to rain down through the Florida skies, peeling off to the right one of the solid rockets. So the indication is that the explosion was not in that rocket, at least. And that's what happened. And as we indicated to you a few moments ago, we expect in about 10 minutes or so to have from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, I have to get this out of the way because we have a guest coming up here dealing with science policy. Tell me who you are.
I'm John Logston. I'm the director of the Science Policy Program at George Washington University here in Washington. Spent 20 years of a career tracing the history and development of the U.S. civilian space program.
There's been an awful lot of speculation so far today, Mr. Logston, as you know, about what happens now to the American space program. This, quite plainly, is a very serious setback. Is it your guess that there will be a major reevaluation, not of the effort to go into space, because that will go forward? I mean, science will go on at this point.
It must.
It must indeed, because that's part of the risk, that how we learn, after all. But what about the shuttle program and whether or not we should have a more broadly based program rather than, as I have been saying here this afternoon, all of our eggs in this one basket?
Well, one big difference between the last accident 19 years ago and this time is that we've got 24 successes before this tragedy. We know the shuttle system works and works well. Fragile and obviously risky. Every time it goes off, it's risky. We now have 3 in the spare parts for 1 more if we choose to put it together. But we clearly need a broader base for access to space. To depend on one system for everything we want to do is probably not good planning.
So we don't have to scrap the shuttle program altogether, but what we ought to be doing is looking at whether or not we want to concentrate on the shuttle program or spread it out a little bit so that we have some rockets that don't have to have manpower required to go up with them.
That's right. There are plenty of things that we've been doing with the shuttle that we could do with expendable launch vehicles. Really, the shuttle ought to be used for what it and it alone can do, and it gives us remarkable capabilities in those areas.
Has the shuttle been worth it so far?
Yes.
Setting apart this tragedy, of course.
Setting apart, but it has opened up living, working, finding out what human capabilities are in space in a way that cannot be done.
And yet we're well behind the curve that NASA originally set out in terms of expectations about how it could be paid for and how many launches that they could have.
Oh, indeed. But part of that is not NASA's fault. It's a public decision not to spend the money, make the investment at the pace that could have resulted in a much faster program. Part of it is the kind of optimists that people that want to go in space are, that always look at the high end of expectations.
So, Logston, what is this going to do to the President's Star Wars program or the Strategic Defense Initiative?
I don't think it has anything to do with it, except the shuttle was a test bed for a lot of those experiments. It does show, it seems to me, how risky, how uncertain doing things in space still is, to have a whole defense system based on technology that has to work.
And politically, that will open some fresh territory, won't it, for the President's critics?
I believe so.
Mr. Logston, as you look at the space program and the American attitudes toward about it, have we become too blasé about high technology and the leading edge of technology, about what it can do and the risks that are involved?
Well, I think that the shuttle was supposed to be routine, and we were beginning to treat it as routine. What was special about this mission was Krista McAuliffe. Otherwise, it would have been just another mission. The other 6 people are not public personalities, equally as adventurous and taking as many risks. The public was excited this weekend as we got the images back from Uranus. The program continues to both do routine, useful things and break out into the future.
Mr. Washington, thanks very much for coming by.
Right.
From George Washington University.
That's correct.
Lifetime of study, effectively, all of your adult life of science policy.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are awaiting now in about 3 minutes, as I say, the news conference. And before we go to Steve Delaney, what we want to do is show you briefly a piece of videotape that we have here in Washington. Congressman Bill Nelson, who made a ride in the last shuttle that went up successfully. And he talked about whether or not these astronauts who were involved in today's explosion had any chance at all. Congressman Bill Nelson.
Even if there had been ejection seats, from my knowledge of the system and observing today what happened, there would not have been any opportunity for escape by ejecting, given the flame that consumed after the initial explosion. In my personal knowledge, would I know if anybody would have, on that crew, had a chance to know that something was wrong? And the answer to that is no.
If there's anything, I suppose, that we can be grateful for, it appears to us, at least, from the naked eye, from this distance, that any deaths that may have occurred, that appear to have occurred, all those deaths were instantaneous. It was an explosion of great magnitude. As I indicated to you a few moments ago, Roy Neal was told by scientists that that was an explosion the equivalent of a small nuclear charge. To put it quite bluntly, it does appear that those astronauts and Krista McAuliffe simply didn't know what hit them. That the explosion happened instantaneously. And of course, as you saw, there were lots of pieces of debris that rained down into the Atlantic Ocean. At the Kennedy Space Center now at Cape Canaveral, Florida, Steve Delaney, who has been there all day long witnessing what for him was a thrilling moment, the liftoff of the space shuttle. And it is, for those of you who have not seen it, when you see it in person, there's nothing quite like it. And then had that thrill turn into a horror of watching the space shuttle come apart in the skies. What's the latest from there, Steve, in terms of what the NASA scientists are going to tell us and when?
I wish I could preview it. We just don't know, Tom. They've been sliding this back about 5 minutes at a time for quite a while now. Jess Moore is going to conduct the briefing. Apparently, he's going to do it himself. Jess Moore has been running the manned space program. NASA is a little bit understaffed at the top right now because James Beggs, the administrator, is kind of on a leave of absence while he handles some legal problems. Jess Moore has been running it as the associate director for manned spaceflight, which means he's in charge of those who are associated with the shuttle program. And earlier, before any of this took place, he was the one who was conducting the briefings to say that, well, there was a problem with the weather here or there, or in the case of the delay that rolled the thing over until through the weekend, there was a problem with a mechanical device, a door handle of all things, that they couldn't quite pull out because it has to be replaced before they can lift off. And Jess Moore was the one who was in charge. He's in transit. He's on his way to assume administration of the Johnson Space Center in Houston. And from now on, that'll be his post, and there'll be another person assigned here to take care of the manned spaceflight program. But he will conduct the briefing, and I'd like to be able to suspect that the reason they've been putting it back is perhaps they are trying to collate and gather together little bits and pieces of information which would allow him to give us as definitive a look as we've had yet as to, if not why it happened, certainly what happened. And the briefing is about to begin, and the speaker is Hugh Harris, the spokesman.
Hey, Delaney?
Yes, Tom.
All right, here we are now.
As I address you here this afternoon. At 11:40 a.m. this morning, the space program experienced a national tragedy with the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger approximately a minute and a half after launch from here at the Kennedy Space Center. I regret that I have to report that based on very preliminary searches of the ocean where the Challenger impacted this morning, these searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived. The dedicated crew members of Challenger are Commander Francis Dick Scobie, pilot Michael J. Smith, mission specialist Dr. Judy Resnick, Ellison Onizuka, and Dr. Ronald McNair. And payload specialists on board were Krista McAuliffe and Greg Jarvis. All early indications in the Launch Control Center, the Kennedy Space Center, have indicated that the launch was normal up to approximately 11:40 a.m. this morning, about a minute or so into the flight. Flight controllers in the Launch Control Center here and in the Mission Control Center in Houston were polled immediately after the explosion, reported that they did not see anything unusual up to that point. The solid rocket booster recovery ships were immediately dispatched to the area, approximately 18 or so miles downrange from Kennedy, along with various Coast Guard and military ships, helicopters, and planes. I have taken an immediate action to form an interim investigating board to implement early activities in this tragedy. Data from all of the shuttle instrumentation, photographs, launch pad systems, hardware, cargo, ground support systems, and even notes made by any member of the launch team and flight ops team are being impounded for study. A formal board will be established by the acting administrator very, very shortly. Subsequent reports on this tragedy will be made by this formal review board. I am aware and have seen the media is showing footage of the launch today from the NASA Select system. We will not speculate as to the specific cause of the explosion based on that footage. It will take all the data, careful review of that data, before we can draw any conclusions on this national tragedy. Thank you.
Mr. Moore has time for just a couple of questions from each center before returning to the effort in investigating this tragedy. Please wait for the microphone and give your name and your affiliation. And we'll start right here with Jacqueline Bolden from Channel 6.
There were some reports that the shuttle perhaps rose a little slower than in previous launches, and there seemed to be a loud noise, and then the noise kind of backed off, and then a rush of noise again. Did you get any reports from anyone else that this seemed different from the people who either experienced it, saw it here live?
I have not heard any reports at all relative to that effect that you just described. None whatsoever.
Okay. Up here in the third row, Michael.
My name's Kevin Hamilton from WGIR in Manchester. The entire Teacher in Space program was designed to introduce more people, specifically youngsters, to the space program. This obviously is not the introduction you intended to make. What do you think the effect, the long-term impact that this is going to have on the youngsters that you were hoping to attract?
Well, I think we'll have to address that as time goes on. And again, I think today, the events of the day makes it much too early for me to speculate on the long-term impacts.
Okay, Al Selstead from Baltimore Sun in the first row.
Mr. Moore, at this time, do you have any estimate of how much liquid fuel was in the external tank at the time of the explosion, and how much explosive power, say in terms of TNT, that remaining liquid fuel might have been equal to?
No, sir, not at this time. You realize what we've been doing since 11:40 this morning is we immediately pulled our senior management together in this program, and I formed an interim board to ensure that all relevant data to this event would be impounded and would be made accessible to the investigative people that will go and take a look at it. I can't answer your specific questions relative to how much fuel was on board at this point in time. The board, when it's formally reported by the administrator, formally formed by the acting administrator, I'm sure will go into those kinds of questions, but I can't answer it right now.
Okay, we're going to take one more question here before going to the Johnson Space Center for questions. Here in the right opposite you, Jackie.
Peter Van Sant from CBS News. We received a call today from a member of an academic group who said he was on a tour group that was at the Pad 39B on Saturday night. This group was supposed to get off the bus to take a close look at the shuttle, but was not allowed to because this caller says they were told that a derrick arm had struck one of the tanks on the shuttle and that some repair work was being done. Are you aware of this incident, and are you aware of any problems at all with either the external tank or the two solid rocket boosters?
No, we looked at that on Saturday. There was not even in the same area that of the tank. It was a small box, heater box, that had about 1/4 of an inch of the insulation out of 5 inches that was scraped. It was a very minor scrape. It was repaired. And everybody, all the experts in the program took a look at that, and so we closed it off at that point in time.
Wait for the microphone. I have to have the microphone.
There was no damage to any tank, or this arm did not strike any tank as far as you know?
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, we're going to the Johnson Space Center for questions. Just a couple of questions.
This is the Johnson Space Center. We have a question from Paul Reeser, Associated Press.
Yes, Mr. Moore. Was there any debris of any description recovered by the vessels, and if so, what was it?
We do not have any detailed debris reports at this point in time. That certainly is something that we're looking at, and we will be impounding all the debris that we recover, and we've set up plans here to store that debris so that the investigating group can go in and look at that and assess that in great detail. I do not have any detailed reports right now on debris.
Bruce Nichols.
Mr. Moore, with all the delays that you experienced last week, the delay again this week, was there any pressure building at all to try to get this one off the ground? Was the pressure up there? And who made the final decision to go or no go?
There was absolutely no pressure to get this particular launch off. We have always maintained that flight safety is our top priority consideration in the program. And we look at the status and readiness of the systems based on that. We thoroughly reviewed the activities over the weekend and yesterday, and continually reviewed the status of Challenger right up until launch this morning. All of the people involved in this program, to my knowledge, felt that Challenger was quite ready to go, and I made the decision, along with the recommendation from the team supporting me, that we launch.
We're going to the Marshall Space Flight Center for a couple of questions.
Martin Berkey with Huntsville Times. Can you tell me what this does to the schedule on down the line, including the launch at Vandenberg?
No, I'm not prepared to do that. What I have done is basically suspend operations for a few days till we can sit down and assess this. And, you know, we're obviously not going to pick up any flight activity until we fully understand what the circumstances were relative to this morning's launch. So in the interim, near-term time, we basically suspended operations until we get a handle on what our problems were this morning.
Nick Miller, WAFF Television in Huntsville. What part will Marshall Space Flight Center play in the investigation, since the propulsion system was the responsibility of the Space Flight Center here?
Well, they obviously have to play a very strong role in the investigating what happened this morning. As you know, the Space Shuttle program is built around a team effort, not only involving the Marshall Center, but also the Kennedy Space Center and the Johnson Space Center. All of the elements have different responsibilities, and clearly Marshall has the propulsive responsibilities on the shuttle. They will play a very dominant role, as will the other three centers I mentioned, as well as anybody that is contributing to the overall program and has some relevant information to add will certainly play a part.
Okay, we're moving to Washington for questions from NASA headquarters. Okay, there is a problem with our audio circuits to Washington. We are going to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena.
Bill Hines of the Chicago Sun-Times. Mr. Moore, in your opening remarks, you mentioned the appointment of this interim review board and said that it would be making statements from time to time. Not to put any adverse interpretations on this, it sounds a little bit like a news blackout, and I'm wondering if your objective is to consolidate information, what will be the point of issue of all those announcements in the future? And are other people not involved in that review board forbidden to talk?
Well, let me correct your statement. First of all, I said that I had appointed an interim review board. That interim review board is composed of the senior members of the NASA team here to take immediate actions on impounding data. The acting administrator is expected to appoint a formal review board very shortly, and it will be left up to that review board in order to determine its progress reports in terms of their findings. What we have done here today is to move very quickly so that all relevant data could be impounded and all actions that are needed to be taken in order to preserve as much information as we can on the circumstances of this morning can be preserved. And that's the nature of the work that I've implemented today, and I expect a formal board to be established very, very shortly, within the next day or so, by the acting administrator.
This is Roy Neal, NBC News. Jess, you've said, I believe, that future flights are temporarily frozen. The United States space program, as a result, is at a halt. Now, based on your experience, how long would you estimate that this investigation will take? 6 months, a year, before you get back in business?
Roy, it is, as you know, it is very difficult to estimate that time. It's going to be a function of what the board finds were the difficulties today and what corrective actions have to be taken before we feel confident and feel safe to fly again. And I clearly am not in a position to speculate today the length of time involved in making that determination. It will be done just as quickly as we possibly can, but also as prudently as we possibly can and as thoroughly as we possibly can.
One more question from JPL.
Bill Hines again. I've got to follow up on that first question of mine. I understand now that there will be announcements made after the permanent board is appointed. Is that correct?
There will be an announcement, I'm sure, of the members of the permanent board, yes. I believe that will be correct, and then I think that board will determine its rate of reporting based on the progress of its findings.
Okay, we're going next to the Washington NASA headquarters.
Are there any indications of sabotage or attack on the shuttle?
Okay, here. I'm sorry, we didn't read that question. And while they're repairing that circuit to Washington, we'll go to the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland.
Mark Weaver, WBAL Radio in Baltimore. Has this raised any questions about how reliable the space shuttle is? Might there just be too many things that could go wrong with a vessel this complicated?
Well, that question, I'm sure, will be asked, and I don't want to speculate on that at this point in time. That's certainly a logical question for somebody to ask.
Ken Gerald from WDVM in Washington. Were there any unusual weather conditions aloft or any unusual weather conditions during the launch?
None that we observed that I recall. We did put up some weather balloons early this morning. We did look at load conditions as we normally do, and the winds aloft looked good. We didn't have any exceedances as far as our load indicators are concerned, to my knowledge. And we thought everything was in good shape for a launch this morning.
Mr. Moore, I.J. Hudson from WRC-TV. Has it become a problem that you have been too good in the past, that the American people have seen flawlessly perform missions on TV almost routinely, and that something like this happens all of a sudden, it hits home even harder?
Well, I don't know how to answer your question specifically. We always strive in every flight that we perform to be as reliable and as safe as we possibly can, and to do everything that we can to ensure that the vehicle and the systems are all ready to fly. Flight safety is our #1 priority in the Space Shuttle program. And certainly when you see an event like this morning, we are going to have to do a very detailed assessment of the set of circumstances to try to understand what occurred, and we will then in turn assess the impacts from that to determine where we go in the future.
I think you can hear it over the speaker. Okay, back here at the Kennedy Space Center, we only have time for a couple more questions. Jay Barbary from NBC News in the front row here.
Jess, I would like to know if you know what happened to Challenger. Can we assume that it was consumed in the explosion? And can you tell us specifically what you know now that the recovery crew has recovered in the impact area?
I have not gotten a briefing, Jay, on what the recovery team has found at this point in time. And I have basically looked at the NASA Select photos and so forth that you did, and all I can say is that it appeared from those photos that there was an explosion. And that's about all I can say at this point in time.
Okay, we have time for only one more question, and James Fisher from the Orlando Sentinel has had his hand up a long time.
Jess, I realize this is a rather forward-thinking question, but what is the situation with the Rockwell plant about the possibility for ordering another shuttle? Has the assembly line been shut down? What's the situation with that?
Well, as we've discussed in the past, we are manufacturing structural spares for an orbiter system, and that manufacturing process is continuing. We are also buying spares for the current fleet that we have, and there is a production capability there if and when it's decided that that's the next step we want to do, is to move forward and do that. So I think the bottom line answer to your question is yes, that is a possibility, that we could implement a production capability for another orbiter if that were decided to be the thing to do.
Okay, I'm sorry to have to wind this up now. Mr. Moore has to get back immediately. As you know, he's been here since very early in the morning, and there's much to be done. Thank you all. Thank you.
That's the news conference from the Kennedy Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Florida, where we heard Jess Moore with the first definitive, although not wide-ranging, reaction of NASA to what happened today at about 1 minute and 30 seconds, as he indicated, after a liftoff of the Space Shuttle Challenger. It blew up. He would not speculate at all on what may have happened. He would not even say whether he believed that the shuttle itself, that is the aircraft, the space aircraft, was consumed in the explosion or whether it went down intact. And then we believe if it did that, in fact, it would have broken up when it hit the water. He would not even comment on that. He did say that all tapes, all notes, all reactions now have been impounded. There will be a full investigation. And he says, I regret, I have to report that there is no evidence that any member of the crew survived this explosion. And as we have been looking at this gigantic fireball all day long, there is no indication that anyone could have survived that no ejection system could have permitted any kind of an escape to safety on the part of the 7 people on board, including Krista McAuliffe. Here once again is the stop action. That is the shuttle itself on the bottom part, as you can see. The solid rocket booster is the white one atop that, and then the big external tank seems to just come apart, as you can see. And as the fire races through it, it triggers this enormous explosion. It's the dark area between the 2 white areas that we're looking at. That's the external tank, although it's not well defined in this picture. This is it in slow motion. You see where that begins to break up there? Well, the solid rocket booster itself continues to go, and then we saw it break away. Now, there's another one on the other side, of course, but it does appear that it's the solid rocket booster, and that flame, as you can see, consumes the space shuttle in which 7 astronauts, including teacher Krista McAuliffe, 37 years old, of Concord, New Hampshire, tragically watched by her husband and her 2 children today, as well as by her parents, and they could barely believe their eyes as they watched that unfold in the bright blue skies over Florida. It was a tragic end to what everyone had hoped would be a triumphant flight for this young school teacher and her 6 associates, who were all veteran members of the astronaut program. To bring you up to date, in about 9 minutes, we expect to hear from President Reagan speaking directly to the nation from the Oval Office. All other official business today in this nation's capital, as you might expect, has been set aside. The president was scheduled to address the joint session of Congress tonight, a brief thematic speech of what he hoped for the next year. That now has been postponed at least a week until next Tuesday night is the current schedule. The president will speak to us at 5 o'clock in 9 minutes Eastern time from the White House tonight. And then we'll have a brief pause after that, and we'll go on with our business of covering this story. The president received word of this tragedy while he was preparing for a briefing today in the Oval Office. It was delivered to him by Vice President Bush and Admiral Poindexter, who is the Chief of National Security Affairs for the White House. The president then watched a television replay. It was, of course, the idea of his administration to put a teacher in space in an effort to engage this generation in space exploration and what can be learned from it. Krista McAuliffe was chosen in a nationwide competition, then selected from 10 finalists. Mrs. Reagan was watching in the private quarters upstairs live when the explosion occurred. Her reaction was to say, "Oh my God," and then to pray, hope against hope, that somebody could survive. Robert Bazell at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. Bob, based on what Jess Moore had to say so far, apart from the fact that we know that there will be a procedure involved in the investigation and that all future flights are, for the moment at least, frozen, we didn't learn a great deal, but that's understandable, isn't it?
It is understandable because obviously they don't know a great deal yet. However, there was one point that might give us a clue to what's going to happen in the next few days and weeks and months, which was a question that he didn't really answer that came from William Hines of the Chicago Sun-Times, which is to do with whether there is a news blackout here. And it could be interpreted either way, but it sounds like NASA doesn't want to have a whole lot to say for a long time, and so it may be a while before we know what goes on. The NASA under the Reagan administration has taken a slightly different attitude about how it relates to the press. It certainly has been open. It certainly is showing us everything, but they haven't been as eager to share everything with the press as they were under previous administrations. It'll be very interesting to see how they respond now when they're under a great deal of pressure, when there'll be a great demand to get leaks to try to find out what's going on. But right now it looks like they're clamping down everything. They want to, as he said, to impound everything, including the notes that the engineers, technicians made on the pad to try to find out. So it doesn't look like we're going to find anything out for a long time. Tom?
Thanks very much, Bob Bazell, who is at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, where, as I indicated earlier, he was out there for some developments in the Voyager space program. That's the unmanned space probe, of course, that just sent back those extraordinary pictures of the moons of Uranus. So it has been a 3 or 4 day period of the trials and triumphs of space, the tragedies and the triumphs, really, because there was so much to be learned from those pictures as well. And we had all hoped that we would learn something from this space shuttle. To hear from Krista McAuliffe, a gifted young teacher filled with enthusiasm and energy. Tragically, her children, Scott 9 and Caroline 6, were there today when it all blew up. And in Concord, New Hampshire, a school auditorium filled with students watching first with unrestrained joy and then in disbelief as they saw those television pictures of the contrails spewing off debris into the Atlantic Ocean today as well. We want to talk to you just for a few moments, if we can, about these people who are all involved, not only Krista McAuliffe, but the other 6 regular members of the astronaut crew as well. We don't want to lose sight of who they were. This is Francis Richard Scobie. He was the 46-year-old commander, a Vietnam veteran. His wife's name is June. They have 2 children. Career Air Force officer, rank of major. He had talked to Bob Bazell earlier about the prospect that at some point one of these would blow up, and he said he wasn't sure that the country was prepared for that. Another member of the crew, Gregory Jarvis, 41-year-old payload specialist. That is, that he worked back in the payload bay on the various experiments and the satellite launches that they would be involved in. His wife's name is Marcia, 3 children. He's an engineer with Hughes Aircraft Company. He was bumped from the earlier December shuttle in favor of Congressman Bill Nelson, whom we heard from earlier today. And then, of course, our school teacher, and she did in a way belong to all of us, Sharon Krista McAuliffe, 37 years old. Her husband's name is Stephen. She has 2 children, as I indicated. She was going to conduct, in effect, classrooms in space. Her legacy was to be that she would be the first teacher to successfully complete a mission. It will not be that now. Ronald McNair, one of 4 black astronauts in the program. He's 45 years old. He has 2 children and a magna cum laude graduate of North Carolina A&T. He's a Ford Foundation fellow. He's a mission specialist. That means that he doesn't fly the spacecraft. He works on the various programs that are involved there. Ellison S. Onizuka, 39-year-old mission specialist. His wife's name is Lorna. They have 2 children. He was a U.S. Air Force test pilot and a Commendation Medal winner. And I'm unable to see our picture to tell you what we're showing you at this time. There's Judith Resnick. She is a PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Maryland. She's one of the women in the astronaut program, the 2nd woman to go into space. And of course, she was looking forward to a successful mission. And tragically, she too died. Michael Smith, a 40-year-old co-pilot. His wife, Jane, has 3 children. He's a Navy test pilot. He holds 5 military honors. A mix, really, of scientists, civilians, and military flyers who were brought together, along with a school teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, on really a day that will live in our darkest memory, when all that goes wrong went wrong all at once in the space program. This space program from which we have expected only success and achievement, human achievement and technological achievement. Today, those expectations, those beliefs were just shattered for us in the skies over Florida.
The hydraulic power units have started. T-minus 21
It's the
seconds,
monitor.
and the solid rocket booster engine gimbal now underway. T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have main engine start. 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now controlling. Roger, roll, Challenger. Good, roll program confirmed. Challenger now heading downrange. Engines beginning throttling down now at 94%. Normal throttles for most of the flight, 104%. We'll throttle down to 65% shortly.
As you can see,
3 engines running normally.
we're approaching the critical stage. They're going from 65% power to 104% power.
Velocity 2,257 feet per second. Altitude 4.3 nautical miles. Downrange distance 3 nautical miles.
They're at about 5 miles in space, 18 miles downrange.
Throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up. Challenger, go at throttle up.
The last words from Richard Scobie. Then the explosion.
1 minute 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical
The debris began to scatter across the sky.
Fred? 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 I must have monitors up here.
As I say, we have shown that to you repeatedly again and again and again today. It is not that we have a ghoulish curiosity. We just think that it's important that all members of the audience who are coming to their sets at different times of the day have an opportunity to see it. And of course, everyone is led to their own speculation based on what happened here today as well. We are now awaiting the arrival of President Reagan in the Oval Office, where he will directly address the nation on this tragedy. All schedules have been scrambled here in Washington, as I'm sure that they have been across the country today, as we try to deal with the enormity of this tragedy. What we have here is the President speaking to the nation today about this national tragedy, as it was described by Jess Moore, instead of addressing the country tonight on what he had hoped would be a message of hope and peace and a forward-looking future for America, talking about family values and the hope of the economy. That was the State of the Union address, which has now been, of course, postponed until next Tuesday, and the President will talk to us from the Oval Office. Chris Wallace will be standing by thereafter to talk about the investigation machinery that has already been put in place. The White House on a stark and somber day. The President was informed as he prepared for his State of the Union address tonight. It was his idea, as I indicated earlier, to put a teacher in space, and he felt, as he indicated to reporters when he met with them earlier at the Roosevelt Room, a great personal loss and sympathy, thinking especially of the husband and the children of Krista McAuliffe, who was lost today in that explosion. And now here is the President of the United States.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd planned to speak to you tonight to report on the State of the Union. But the events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers and overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Krista McAuliffe. We mourn their loss as a nation together. To the families of the 7, we cannot bear, as you do, the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us. We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them. I've always had great faith in and respect for our space program, and what happened today does nothing to diminish it. We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. I want to add that I wish I could talk to every man and woman who works for NASA or who worked on this mission and tell them your dedication and professionalism have moved and impressed us for decades, and we know of your anguish. We share it. There's a coincidence today. On this day, 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and a historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Well, today, we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them, this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
President Reagan with a moving statement, a personal statement really, from the White House, from the Oval Office today, explaining that he had hoped tonight to address the State of the Union in a joint session of Congress, but instead he was forced to share with the American public this national tragedy. He talked about these brave people who have slipped the surly bonds of earth and touched the face of God. And he addressed as well, quite directly it seemed to me, the school children of the country, many of whom were watching today because, after all, this was part of the effort to put a school teacher in space, was to reach out to this new generation of youngsters, to tell them about space, to excite them about the prospects of going to this new frontier. And the president talked, too, about Sir Francis Drake, who was an explorer of the same magnitude of an earlier time. Incidentally, it may be helpful to those of you who are parents that we had here earlier today a child psychiatrist who talked about how you might deal with the trauma that will set in a household, both among adults and children. And what he said to us was that you should encourage the children to talk about it and share with them your own grief and your own shock and your own emotional feeling. And he suggested as well, it's not a good time for confrontation, not a good time to tell them to stop watching television or to stop reading about it or to stop talking about it. He suggested, too, that it may be a good idea to ask them about the reaction of their pals, the other youngsters, boys and girls, and how they feel about it. In other words, get at it through the back door. But the important thing is, he said, is that as a family, to deal with all of this together, collectively, to show the children that you, too, feel for what has happened today, and that you know that life will go on, and that you'd like to share this very troubling experience with them. Chris Wallace at the White House tonight. Where do we go from here, Chris, in terms of what the president has in mind? He sent Vice President George Bush to the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida, and we're told now that the Vice President will be returning this evening, right? He's going down there symbolically to represent the administration?
Well, I think that's right. There were 2 points, 2 charges that Vice President Bush had as he headed to the Kennedy Space Center, and those were, first of all, to talk to the families. A number of the families of the 7 members of the crew were there at the Cape, and the president wanted Vice President Bush to express his personal condolences on their loss. Secondly, to, in effect, give a presidential push to the investigation of the accident. It's going to be handled by NASA, but the president clearly wanted his vice president there to say that he is desperately interested in finding out exactly what happened.
Okay, Chris Wallace, we want to remind our local stations right here that you can cut away to return to your local programming, but that NBC News coverage of this national tragedy, as it has been so accurately described by NASA officials and by President Reagan, will continue. It will go on now, and we will have our regular schedule of NBC News programming, including NBC Nightly News tonight. But for now, local stations may cut away if they so choose. Chris Wallace, back at the White House. Can you tell us any more of the personal detail? You and I were both there today in the Roosevelt Room when it seemed to me that Don Regan was almost in a state of disbelief, given the low-key way that he announced to us the shuttle has blown up. Details to follow. What was and as I went out into the corridors of the White House, I found people standing around out there looking as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing and being reported to them.
Well, that's right. I guess it's a classic case of what the psychologists call denial. What happened is, to recap briefly, is that Don Regan, the White House Chief of Staff, was holding a briefing for network anchors and for White House correspondents on the President's State of the Union address. We were in the Roosevelt Room across the hall from the Oval Office when one of Regan's aides came in with a small piece of paper, and Regan read it out loud as he read it himself for the first time. It said, "The shuttle has exploded, details to follow." You and the other anchors got up immediately, but in a sense, for most of the rest of us, there was almost a sense of disbelief. Regan, for a couple of minutes, started to go ahead with the briefing, and we kept taking notes, and then suddenly everybody realized that this news was so much bigger than a State of the Union address, and that everything had to be put on the back burner for a while.
And Nancy Reagan was watching in the private quarters of the White House.
That's right. What we are told is that, in fact, she was watching on live television, watching the launch, which has become obviously almost, it seemed, a very routine matter when suddenly she saw the terrible accident. Her press aide quotes her as saying, I guess basically to herself as she watched the camera, "Oh my God, no." And then she said, according to her aide, that she immediately began to pray that there was at least some thread of hope that some person had survived that crash. Apparently now, of course, the hope is gone.
All right, Chris Wallace, we'll ask you to stand by there at the White House to bring us up to date on any additional details that we may have in investigations and on the future of the space program. The president, of course, has been very committed to the space program, and there is the other question that we can't answer tonight and may not be able to for some time, what effect all of this will have on his hopes for the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, more popularly known as Star Wars. The critics certainly will use this as an opportunity to say you cannot build a fail-safe defense in space if you have this kind of a problem with the space shuttle program. One of those on board today was Judy Resnick. She was 36 years old. She would have been 37 years old in April. She has a PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Maryland. She was the second female in space after Dr. Sally Ride, of course, made her famous ride into space as well now. Dr. Resnick flew on the shuttle mission SDS-41D, which was launched from the Kennedy Space Center on August 30th, 1984. I got to know her, however, at the beginning of the space shuttle program when she was one of the experts assigned to the NBC News team so she could be our commentator. And we had, all of us, a good time with Judy because she was a by-the-book astronaut, but she had a real mischievous side to her. She could not believe how informal television was, and we sometimes threw her curves by saying, no, we're not going to do that now. We're going to go over here. And she was able to ride along with us, as it were. In 1981, I had a talk with her about what she had hoped to get out of the space program and about her life in it. And here is some of that conversation now. Dr. Judy Resnick. For 20 years in this country, the word astronaut automatically meant a man, but that's changed. In fact, beginning in 1978, NASA began accepting the first women astronauts. There are now 8 out of the 81 members of the astronaut corps based in Houston. One of the first half dozen to be accepted is Judy Resnick, now 32 years old, a native of Akron, the holder of a doctorate in electrical engineering from the University of Maryland. She is single, she plays the piano, and she's a runner. She's not quite a pilot. I guess you fly in the back seat of the T-38s, right?
That's correct.
So you have certain aeronautical skills and so on.
Yes.
But when you're a little girl growing up in Akron, Ohio, did you say, gee, I'd like to be an astronaut someday?
No, I really didn't think about it until right about 4 years ago when NASA announced that they were looking for astronauts who would be engineers and scientists on the space shuttle, and it was accidental that I heard about it, and I just took a chance and applied.
Yeah. But once you got into the program, wasn't there a little bit of resentment or a little bit of male chauvinism that was demonstrated to you? This is a very male kind of fighter pilot world that you were entering.
Not at all. As a matter of fact, I think everybody leaned over backwards to make sure that we were treated as equals right from the beginning.
Is there anything in the space program that women inherently do better than men?
Not that I can think of. We're smaller, but that's about the only thing.
But that hasn't changed anything?
No.
You had to change the uniform some, though. You did have a little talk with them about that.
Well, the only thing that they had to do was make a smaller size pressure suit. One size fits all, small size for men doesn't fit small women, so we now have an extra small.
Okay. We want to show some videotape of some of the physical training that you have to undergo at NASA. You can talk about that a little bit as we take a look at it now with Judy Resnick. It's a pretty tough program. Were you prepared for this, for the physical difficulty of it?
Well, it's not really so difficult physically. It's a lot of new things, but they lead you through it by the hand. This is a demonstration of
now, wait a minute. That doesn't look like a lot of fun for a Saturday afternoon to me. I don't know about you, but...
Well, you have to learn how to survive in case you have to get out of an airplane in a parachute, and they teach you step by step how to fall, how to be dragged. That's the impact you feel if you go through an ejection seat, and it's really not as bad as it looks. They show you how to fall into the water by, instead of letting you fall the first time, they let you slide down a slide wire. Like I say, they break you into it gradually.
Were you a tomboy when you were a kid?
No.
You weren't, and you took to this right away. You like it?
It's fun.
What's the best part about being an astronaut?
Everything.
You just like it all?
Yes.
You get to exercise your training, electrical engineering, and expand your knowledge enormously, I would think.
Yes, I think the best part technically is that it's a very well-rounded approach to science and technology, and we get to do a little bit of everything and state-of-the-art, and it's always a challenge.
What happens when you meet a man who's not in the space program and doesn't know who you are, and you say, I'm an astronaut? Does he say, yeah, you're too cute to be an astronaut. Come on, little lady, you can't be an astronaut?
I just tell him I'm an engineer.
You don't tell him you're an astronaut?
Not unless he asks.
You really, you mean when you meet people for the first time? What about the whole business about social relationships? Does it make it, are some men threatened by the fact that you're an astronaut?
I don't know. If they are, they're probably not my friends.
Yeah. Judy Resnick, she would have been 37 years old in April. She's a classically trained pianist from Akron, Ohio. She loved the space program more than I can describe for you here today, and really loved going up into space. I had an enthusiastic letter from her not too long ago. She was saying that she was hoping I could come down and watch this one because she was sure it was going to go off on schedule. We used to have a running dialogue about whether NASA could keep to its schedule or not. She was a absolutely wonderfully dedicated astronaut, and it's a great loss to her family and, of course, to the country as well. It just really is an example of the kind of people that you have in the astronaut program. They are so gifted in so many ways. A PhD in electrical engineering. She was an enthusiastic gardener. She was a classical pianist. And despite her protestations that she couldn't do things better than some of the men, all of the men told me that when she operated that big Canadian arm at the back of the payload, she had a great touch, that she had real dexterity. It may have been a result of her piano training, but at any rate, it is a great loss for everybody. We have now a schematic that we can show you that we will superimpose, as it were, over some of the pictures that we saw earlier today. These are the actual pictures, and then the schematic, as you can see, lays over so you can get a better sense of what we're talking about. Could we put that back up there again? Okay, fine. Anyhow, we're watching it now begin to blow up, and as you can see, the shuttle itself was on the bottom. The two solid rocket boosters were on either side, and the external tank is what appeared to come apart, although it's, I must emphasize that Jess Moore from NASA, who knows a great deal more about this than I do, refused to speculate based on those pictures. He's looked on them, he's looked at them, he's listened to all of us as we have made our observations today that it appeared to be a problem with the external tank, and he refused to get into that speculation, as well as he should not get into it, because after all, we want the best kind of investigation to go forward. Bob Bazell at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, right now. Bob, what are they saying out there about the nature of the investigation?
Well, the nature of the investigation isn't something that's being conducted here. This is the headquarters for unmanned spaceflight. However, one of the things that was interesting here is that so many of us who cover space regularly were here because of the Uranus mission of the Voyager spacecraft. And even the most veteran, hardened, experienced space reporter, there was just such a state of shock here among people who had seen so many space launches one after another to see what had happened today. When you're talking about the external fuel tank, and we're just speculating here as we have been all day long, obviously that was what exploded. The question is whether it was the first thing to explode and whether it was the thing that initiated the explosion, and I guess that's the key question, because when we do look at those pictures, there's no question that that huge barrel of liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen, one of the most explosive combinations that human beings can put together, did go up and annihilate everything that had been left of the space shuttle. There's no question about that. The question is what initiated it. One of the things that will certainly be looked at in the investigation, and I'm not at all suggesting that this is what happened, but one of the things that will be examined in the investigation is that there are what NASA calls pyrotechnics. There are explosives on board the shuttle which are designed to blow it up. Now, there are hundreds of safety devices to keep those things from going off accidentally, but there is a man called the range safety officer whose duty it is to watch the shuttle, and in case it starts to go way off course and approach a populated area, he presses a button that would cause the shuttle to blow up. Now, those pyrotechnic devices are one of many, probably hundreds or even thousands of things that they're looking at as a possible malfunction. So, as Jess Moore said before, just from looking at that tape, all that you can see is that there was an explosion. You can't see what caused it, and it's probably going to take them an awful long time. One of the things that was interesting to me, having watched so many launches and looking at it, is that there wasn't a single indication of anything going wrong whatsoever. There was talk about the launch looking slow and everything, but if we've done earlier in the day, if you play it back next to normal launches, in fact, it wasn't slow. It has to do with camera angles. There was talks about funny noise, but that has to do with the wind condition. It was a cold day, so that it would have sounded much different to anybody who was there than it would on a normal 40 humid afternoon. There was no indication whatsoever, because if there had been, they would have radioed it to the crew. There would have been some evidence of it in the conversation. The only thing there was the permission for Dick Scobie, the commander, to go ahead to full throttle, his acknowledgement of that command, and then apparently as he just was going to full throttle, there was the explosion. So it's going to take quite an investigation to find out. At this point, there are no clues whatsoever. Tom?
Thanks very much, Bob Bazell, who, as he indicated, he's watched a good many of those, and they are magnificent sights on takeoff, as they were today, as a matter of fact. In the original flight, I remember a man saying it's a real pant flapper. You have no sense of what it's like on takeoff, the sheer raw power of the space shuttle and its attached propellant systems, until you're there and can feel it, as you actually can, as it sweeps across the Cape, the sound and the reverberations on takeoff, and it's a sight of utter majesty. And then today, that sight of utter majesty turned into a sight of utter horror. John Palmer's in New York now with additional information on this national tragedy, which has been going on now for almost 6 hours. John Palmer.
Yes, Tom, a national tragedy. It is a very sad day, and another sad statistic. A total of 11 children now have apparently lost at least one of their parents as the result of the explosion and the downing of the Space Shuttle Challenger, a catastrophic fire that blew apart the Space Shuttle just about a minute and a half after it took off. A few minutes ago, the Associate Director of NASA and the head of the Houston Space Center, in that very brief announcement and took a few questions down at the Cape, he said that the space program, had experienced a national tragedy, and he said there was no evidence the crew had survived. It's now after sundown in that search area, about 18 miles off the coast from Cape Canaveral, and as Jess Moore told us about 45 minutes ago, they have found no evidence, no debris, and certainly no sign of any survivors whatsoever. Jess Moore announced that he has formed an interim board to investigate, to review the facts right immediately, and to impound all information, all computer data, to get ready for another more formal board that will really look into the cause to see what happened. He said he would not speculate on the cause of the explosion because he said it was just too early, and as Tom just mentioned, he said that he was not going to speculate on the basis of those tragic pictures we see of about a minute and a half into the flight, the explosion there of the Space Shuttle. Again, he said there were no reports of any debris recovered. He was asked if there was any pressure whatsoever to get this particular shuttle off the ground. It had been delayed several days. It was delayed again today a couple of hours because of the freezing temperatures there and because of some icicles. Its predecessor, the Columbia, had been delayed for 7 days. They had planned 15 different space shuttles throughout this year of 1986. Obviously, they're not going to make that schedule, and there was even some doubt because of the delays of the last 2 shuttles that they were going to be able to make it. Moore said that all he could say is, obviously, from his observation and from ours and from everyone's, there was an explosion. He said, for now, the space program is suspended. He said there were no unusual weather conditions whatsoever. He said they sent up the usual airplanes early in the morning. They sent up weather balloons. It has been noted, though, that the jet stream was unusually far to the south in the last 24 hours, moving down over central Florida at about an altitude of 7 to 9 miles. The speed of the jet stream of the winds there clocked at about 100 miles an hour this morning. It was well below freezing. That doesn't mean that this perhaps had anything whatsoever to do with the tragedy that occurred, but it was a low of 25 for several hours overnight at Cape Canaveral, and that came up at about 10 o'clock in the morning to about 32 degrees, and the launch went off at 11:38 Eastern Time, the explosion following about a minute and a half later. There will be, of course, no State of the Union address tonight. The President, addressing the nation a short while ago from the Oval Office, stated, of course, that he wanted to come and talk about the state of the nation, but because of the tragedy, he said he was pained to the core, he and Mrs. Reagan pained to the core, that this was a day of national mourning. He said of the astronauts, they had a hunger to explore the universe. And, of course, he had those comments, those very poignant, very sad comments to the school children. Literally thousands of school kids all across this country were waiting in their classrooms to see this liftoff because the teacher, Christy McAuliffe, was taking off and was going to give exactly 2, I think it was, lessons from outer space. That's the situation now, kind of a wrap-up to the point. Again, it's after dark, and we couldn't expect really many more developments out of that search area. Let's go back now to Washington and Tom Brokaw.
Thank you very much, John Palmer. All manner of little tidbits of information coming our way. Governor Bob Graham, the governor of Florida, who has witnessed a number of those shuttle launches, was on a campaign tour today announcing his candidacy for the Senate, and he saw the takeoff and then the explosion from his airplane as he was flying over Florida. And about the president's message to the school children of America, it's very easy for those of us who are grown-ups to be kind of jaded about the space program. I recall vividly a friend of mine, a grown-up, who was watching a launch of a shuttle and turned to his wife and said, "Oh, it's another boring space launch." When his son, who was about 12 years old at the time, turned to him and said, "Hey, that's my future that you're talking about." And that's what the administration obviously had hoped would be an important part of this mission that the youngsters of this country would think about that as their future. And nowhere was there more attention being paid to this shuttle launch today than in Concord, New Hampshire, the home of Christy McAuliffe. She was a school teacher there of third graders, but these were high school kids watching from an auditorium. The unalloyed joy of high school students with a kind of unofficial holiday as they watched what appeared to be the successful takeoff of the Challenger with Christy McAuliffe on board. And then the realization that something terrible was wrong.
Would everybody please go back to class at this time? We're asking all students to please.
The best and worst, of course, of live television coverage coming together there in that auditorium as we were all able to watch what happened to what turned out to be their friend and then 6 other people that we cared about as a nation, the astronauts, as the shuttle blew up. And we were all suspended for a time between a state of belief and disbelief, not quite sure what we were seeing could in fact happen, because we have come to expect so much from high technology. But then the slow realization that in fact that our worst fears now were being realized. I will tell you that as a journalist who's covered the space program for a long time, that's been at the back of the mind of a lot of us. Maybe one of these will blow up on the pad or blow up in the sky someday and we have to watch it, but we always kind of put it at the back of our mind, never quite believing that it would happen. The astronauts who were involved in today's flight were interviewed before they went off about their feelings and their thoughts. Most of them, of course, not expressing fears because they're not built that way, frankly. Here's what some of them had to say about what lay ahead, they thought.
Dr. McNair, first of all, this is your second flight. Can you give us any perspective on what it's been like for you training this time as opposed to last time, or your sense of anticipation this time as opposed to last time?
Well, starting with my sense of anticipation, I would say it's greater this time than the first, simply because I know how great it is, how nice it is, and how much fun it is, and how fascinating the entire experience is. Training the second time around, I would have to say, is a little easier. A lot of it you've done already. It's a matter of refreshing. I do have some new payloads that I have to start at ground zero with and learn, but having done it really has its advantages. But I do look forward to this, and it's as challenging. One cannot get lax about it, approach it with the same amount of caution as the first or any time, but overall it's not as taxing.
Well, Mr. Jarvis, you are finally going to get to go up. You must, in addition to the fact that you're going to be doing a lot of things for your company, you must be, as an individual, be fairly charged up at this point.
I've been charged up since last March, and so this is kind of a culmination of a dream come true.
Well, what do you look forward to after this, Colonel? You've got a couple of flights. You'll have a couple of flights under your belt after you get back from this one. What's your goal after this?
Well, I hope to stay with the space program. Certainly fly more missions. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, and I expect to stay with the program. Looking forward, like I said, to more missions and some involvement to future programs downstream. So I enjoy the space program. I'm very intrigued by the challenge it offers, and I look forward to staying with it as long as I can.
Is it possible for you to describe the way you describe your anticipation of the mission at this point? You must be excited as well as ready, I would suppose.
Well, I am excited, and I guess I look at it like I look at flying new airplanes back in my career. You know, you prepare as much as you can for it, and knowing that the real thing is going to probably be somewhat different than what the simulator is. But I think what I'm really looking forward to is just the experience of doing the ascent and seeing all the things that everyone comes back and talks about that they see while they're on orbit, watching the crew work together. You know, we've worked a long time now, 9 months or so, putting this whole flight together and watching
everything happen, hopefully close to the way we've planned it. And I'm sure there'll be some problems to take care of along the way, which will be a challenge, and be able to come back and say I've done it, and hopefully go do it again quite a few times.
Both Chris McAuliffe and Greg Jarvis fit very well into the crew, and the things that they're doing, I think, are assets to the space program. And if they're assets to the space program and they're getting people interested in space and getting them to expect to fly in space, and space is in their future, then I think it's good for the country to do that. And if it's good for the country, then they ought to be flying. The people that fly that are good for the country and good for science ought to be there.
Dick Scobie, the Air Force Major who was the commander of this space shuttle flight. The last words that we heard from him, of course, were go for full throttle. He's a retired major in the U.S. Air Force, 46 years old. He would have been 47 years old on May 19th, and other members of that astronaut crew, in addition to Krista McAuliffe. We want to remind our stations once again that we will have continuous coverage here on NBC. NBC News will provide continuous coverage of this national tragedy throughout the early evening, and then there will be a special report tonight at 10 Eastern Time as well. But for those of you who want to return now to your local programming, you may feel free to do so, as I'm sure that you will.
We now join our scheduled program for this time, which is already in progress.
The last show. Not too shabby.
Not bad.
Are you ready to go again?
Yeah, I think it's supposed to get easier, but it doesn't.
Oh, what's more fun than selling ice cream, I would guess, right?
It's a lot more fun.
Yeah, because David's you have an antique ice cream parlor, right? That sounds like a lot of fun. Nice to have you back here. Good luck. Here to introduce the challengers, Summer Bartholomew. Would you like to go visit his ice cream emporium?
My favorite is Rocky Road ice cream.
Rocky Road? I like vanilla. I'm dull. What do I know? Who'd you bring us?
She follows in the footsteps of Florence Nightingale, originally from Lapeer, Michigan. A warm welcome to Patricia Wozniak.
Hello there, Patricia.